In the gilded halls of royal palaces, they wore silk gloves and signed treaties, then slipped away through secret doors. Behind every portrait of duty was a woman rewriting the rules in whispers and locked chambers. These weren't fairy tale princesses. These were queens, duchesses, and rebels in tiaras, who loved dangerously, scandalously, and often unapologetically. Some ruled kingdoms, others ruled hearts. All left a trail of rumors thicker than bloodlines. Welcome to 33 English and British royals who slept with anyone, where the crowns were heavy, but the secrets were heavier. You won't believe who did what, or with whom. Before we slip any further behind palace doors, hit that subscribe button to join the circle of insiders. We've got centuries of scandal to uncover, and trust me, you'll want front row access. While you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We're all eavesdropping across time zones now. 1. Catherine Howard. She was 15 when the rumors started, or at least, that's when they started following her, whispering down palace corridors like the long train of a dress she never quite grew into. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, walked into court like a lamb, smiling, fluttering, humming little tunes she'd heard from musicians in the gardens. But Catherine wasn't just another teenage bride. She was a carefully bred ornament from a disgraced branch of a powerful family, tossed into the most dangerous marriage in England like perfume on a festering wound. And like perfume, her scent lingered in places it shouldn't have. Before the crown, before the royal marriage, there were the boys. Mannix, Derham, names that hung around her like smoke, always just one gust away from reigniting. Francis Derham called her his wife before the king ever laid eyes on her. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. Their relationship was more than a flirtation, less than a contract, but dangerous enough to be both. They shared rooms. They passed love tokens. They made promises no one could verify and everyone could imply. Of course, in the Howard household, that sort of thing wasn't exactly rare. It was a boarding house of near-orphan nobles and hormonal chaos, loosely supervised by dowager duchesses who believed discipline was for the poor. So Catherine wasn't acting out. She was playing by the only rules she'd ever seen enforced. Smile, survive, stay interesting. Enter King Henry. By the time she caught the king's eye, he was already rotting. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but literally, physically. His leg was ulcerated, his temper volcanic, and his pride clinging to whatever illusion of virility he could pay a tailor to embroider. When Catherine danced for him, it wasn't seduction. It was CPR. She revived him. A girl of 16, maybe 17, maybe younger, pretending not to flinch when his eyes traced her body like he was inventorying livestock. She played the part, the blushing bride, the loyal rose, the renewed hope of an aging tyrant who'd already beheaded one wife and annulled another. And for a few months, the court played along. The king gifted her jewels. She gifted him smiles. The Privy Council dared to exhale. But behind the silks and pearls, the past didn't stay politely buried. Because Derham came back, not as a lover, but as a blackmailer. Or perhaps a romantic. Or maybe just a fool. He took a position in her household and hovered like a ghost at a wedding. Then came Thomas Culpeper, a royal favorite, well-dressed, well-bred, well within reach. Their meetings were late at night. Their go-betweens were trembling ladies-in-waiting. Their relationship? Veiled in ambiguity, yet sharp enough to cut through the fabric of court decorum. Catherine was no Anne Boleyn, no political temptress with an agenda and a chessboard. She was chaotic, impulsive, reactive, a girl trying to find control in a palace built entirely from traps. Maybe she loved Culpeper. Maybe she missed Derham. Maybe she just wanted someone her own age who didn't smell like bandages and power. In the end, it didn't matter. The moment the rumors turned into signed confessions, extracted under pressure, tailored for consequence, the outcome was already written. She was accused of adultery, of treason, of being unchaste before marriage. No one asked if she'd ever had a choice. No one cared that the king had moved heaven and parliament to make her his wife, and then crushed her when she didn't play the role of living relic to his dwindling glory. They say Catherine asked for the executioner's block the night before she died, so she could rehearse how to die gracefully. The court took this as a sign of repentance. Historians called it poise, but perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was her only rehearsal for a moment no woman her age should ever have had to memorize. Catherine Howard became a cautionary tale about girlishness, about pleasure, about forgetting your place in a hierarchy where the top is a throne and the bottom is a chopping block. But what really damned her was the thing no one dared say outright. She had loved before the king. Possibly during. Probably again. Which brings us, with an inconvenient sense of déjà vu, to a royal woman who also loved often, and sometimes terribly. Her lovers weren't always kind, her husbands weren't always honest, and her legacy? Still argued over, still stained with suspicion. Mary, Queen of Scots. Beautiful, betrayed, and perhaps just bored enough to fall for the wrong man one too many times. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots. She entered history like a comet, bright, erratic, and guaranteed to set something on fire. Mary, Queen of Scots, was crowned when she was 6 days old, which is far too early to develop an ego but just the right age to begin accumulating enemies. By the time she could walk, half of Scotland was planning to control her. The other half was planning to rescue her, and France was already preparing to accessorize her. She grew up at the French court, where romance wasn't just a pastime, it was a competitive sport. Courtiers flirted as naturally as breathing. Poets crafted love verses the way accountants craft ledgers. Young Mary learned that affection, attention, and political power all shared the same vocabulary. She also learned that being adored was both an advantage and a liability, like being handed a bouquet of roses without gloves. Her first husband, Francis II of France, was gentle, shy, and tragically unprepared for life. Their marriage was less about passion and more about preserving alliances. He adored her, worshipped her even. But Mary? She seemed to experience him the way one might experience a childhood pet, suddenly promoted to fiancé. When Francis died young, Mary wept, of course, but she also looked toward Scotland with a kind of resigned curiosity. As one looks at a family inheritance you can't refuse but definitely didn't ask for. Scotland welcomed her back with the same warmth one reserves for a tax audit. She was tall, elegant, Catholic, fluent in romance and poetry, everything her rough, suspicious nobles weren't. They watched her every smile, every letter, every prolonged glance at any man who might be standing too close. And Mary, being charming, being human, being lonely in a country she barely remembered, gave them plenty to gossip about. Some of it innocent, some of it conveniently ambiguous. Then came Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a man with excellent cheekbones, a mediocre brain, and a dangerous sense of entitlement. He was tall, glamorous, and flattered her constantly, which, in fairness, is the perfect combination if one is 19, widowed, and tired of being handled like a diplomatic package. They married quickly. Too quickly. The court murmured. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow hard enough to bend iron. But Mary insisted she loved him, and perhaps she did. Or perhaps she simply mistook charisma for character, which is a historic royal pastime. Darnley soon proved he had all the maturity of a damp candle. He drank too much, argued too loudly, demanded too many privileges, and grew jealous of anyone who breathed within 10 feet of Mary. His suspicion eventually fixated on David Rizzio, Mary's secretary, talented, elegant, and constantly present. Were they lovers? Every historian will answer that question differently, depending on their mood, their degree, and whether they personally enjoy melodrama. The truth probably rests somewhere between affection and necessity. Rizzio was her confidant, her support, and a convenient lightning rod for her husband's insecurities. Darnley famously stormed into a dinner party, dragged Rizzio away, and committed a violent act that would stain Mary's memory forever. She was pregnant at the time. She was terrified. She was, for the first time, truly aware that Darnley wasn't just immature. He was dangerous. Then came James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Strong, calculating, sarcastic, and, importantly, not Darnley. He offered her stability, or the illusion of it. He towered over her court the way a thundercloud towers over a sheep pasture, ominous but undeniably impressive. Was he her lover before Darnley's suspicious death? Rumors swirled like midwinter winds. Some said yes, others said no. Many said, "We don't know, but it's more fun to assume." Darnley's house mysteriously exploded one night, and he was found dead outside, unharmed by the blast but definitely dead. The cause? Ambiguous enough to fuel 450 years of conspiracy theories. Bothwell was implicated. Mary defended him. Then she married him, rapidly, strangely, and in a haze of emotional exhaustion and political coercion. It was the worst timing imaginable, like proposing marriage at a funeral. Her nobles revolted. Her subjects questioned her judgment. Elizabeth Thirster sharpened her diplomacy and her side-eye, and Mary, still young, still vulnerable, still human, saw her world crumble with the same speed she had once seen admiration fall into infatuation. She fled Scotland, seeking refuge with Elizabeth. Instead, she received 19 years of imprisonment, during which gossip about her lovers became the only way people remembered she had once been alive. Letters were forged. Rumors ballooned. Lovers were invented for her the way poets invent metaphors. Excessively, and with questionable fidelity. After years of confinement, Mary was executed, not for lovers, not for husbands, not for poor romantic decisions, but for allegedly conspiring against the English crown. Yet her romantic reputation stuck harder than any political accusation. Centuries later, scholars still argue over every man she ever smiled at, every correspondent she ever trusted, every courtier who ever lingered a moment too long near her chair. Her story remains a mystery, not because she was reckless, but because she lived in a world where power, passion, and survival were inseparably entangled. She loved, yes. She misjudged, absolutely. She was betrayed, often. But the real enigma is how a woman so adored could be so thoroughly destroyed by the very affection she inspired. And if Mary's life was a storm of tangled romances and political catastrophes, then Queen Caroline of Brunswick would take the idea of marital disaster and elevate it into a full-scale public spectacle. Because if Mary's lovers were whispered about in candlelit rooms, Caroline's were whispered about in taverns, Parliament, and, most insultingly, by her own husband. And while Mary's story fades into whispers and locked letters, you're still here, listening, watching, digging deeper. So if royal secrets are your thing, make sure you're subscribed. This rabbit hole goes much deeper. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you decoding scandals over lunch, or letting history ruin your sleep schedule at 3 a.m.? Either way, you belong here. 3. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Queen Caroline of Brunswick entered the British monarchy like a gust of wind blowing through a room full of fragile antique vases, bold, loud, unpredictable, and absolutely guaranteed to break something. She married George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, a man whose personality could generously be described as expensive, and less generously described as perpetually offended. Their marriage was doomed before it even began, partly because George was drunk during the ceremony, partly because Caroline couldn't stand him, and partly because neither of them had any emotional stability left in their pockets by the end of their first week together. Still, Caroline did what many aristocratic women before her had done. She improvised. And improvisation, in Caroline's hands, meant collecting companions the way some people collect stamps, enthusiastically, publicly, and with very little interest in whether the collection was considered appropriate. Caroline's rumored lovers included knights, courtiers, chamberlains, diplomats, servants, and one particularly memorable Italian named Bartolomeo Pergami. Her affection for Pergami became a centerpiece in the decades-long scandal that defined her life, her reputation, and the monarchy's increasingly desperate attempts to look respectable while behaving like a soap opera cast. But before Pergami, before the trial, before the public cheering crowds and the whispering court, Caroline was a young bride trapped in a marriage that felt like a contractual misunderstanding. George didn't like her. Caroline didn't like him. He found her loud and messy. She found him pretentious and fragile. Their incompatibility was so dramatic that even their servants reportedly exchanged worried glances. The one thing they produced together, besides headlines, was a daughter, Princess Charlotte. Caroline adored her. George tried to limit Caroline's access to her. Their co-parenting dynamic could best be described as legal warfare with occasional cakes. As Caroline drifted away from her husband, she drifted toward other men, sometimes innocently, sometimes ambiguously, sometimes so openly that even the palace walls raised their eyebrows. She surrounded herself with young officers, charming musicians, foreign aides, and men who were simply delighted to be acknowledged by a woman who laughed easily and cared very little about protocol. The British court, of course, saw everything, or imagined everything, or saw nothing and simply invented the rest. Rumor was their national sport, and Caroline was their Olympics. By 1814, Caroline had grown fed up with the coldness of court life and the claustrophobia of polite society. So she did what any self-respecting scandal magnate would do. She left. She sailed off to Italy, where the weather was warm, the people were friendly, and the gossip was more musical than malicious. Enter Bartolomeo Pergami. He was handsome, attentive, and blessed with the kind of cheerful loyalty that Caroline had rarely experienced. He started as a servant. He ended as something much closer, though the exact nature of their relationship remains delightfully unconfirmed. They traveled together. They dined together. They sat together during long Mediterranean evenings, talking about everything from politics to pastries. And wherever they went, rumors followed like overexcited pigeons. British envoys in Italy began writing letters back home, filled with suggestive detail and questionable accuracy. They described the architecture of Caroline's villas, the seating arrangements of her dinners, the suspiciously intimate atmosphere of her household. They noted every smile, every gesture, every instance where she failed to behave like a queen and instead behaved like, well, a human being with a personality. When George ascended the throne, he made it his personal mission to destroy Caroline's reputation. He demanded investigations, interrogations, committees, affidavits, testimonies, and any other bureaucratic weapon he could swing. This led to the infamous Milan Commission, a team tasked with gathering evidence of adultery. They collected gossip the way cryptozoologists collect blurry photographs, passionately, creatively, and without any confirmation whatsoever. By the time Caroline returned to England in 1820 to claim her title as Queen, the entire nation was buzzing with scandal. Parliament held a trial-like proceeding, the Pains and Penalties Bill, to strip her of her crown on the grounds of alleged impropriety. The public flooded the streets in her support, not because they believed she was innocent, but because they found George so insufferable that even a potentially unfaithful queen seemed more relatable. Caroline attended the hearings with her trademark chaotic dignity, overconfident, underprepared, and absolutely unwilling to be polite. Witnesses testified. Lawyers argued. Anonymous servants claimed they had seen compromising shadows through suspiciously convenient curtains. The entire trial read like a gossip column accidentally printed in the legal section of a newspaper. In the end, the bill failed. Caroline won. But victory came flavored with irony. She remained queen in name, yet barred from George's coronation. When she tried to attend anyway, guards physically blocked her. It was petty. It was dramatic. It was exactly the sort of ending her life seemed determined to create. Caroline died 1 year later, exhausted by the endless battles, the public scrutiny, and the emotional drain of being both adored and condemned at once. She left behind a legend, a woman too vibrant for a court that preferred its queens quiet, obedient, and, if possible, slightly miserable. If Caroline's lovers were loud, messy, and politically explosive, then Princess Margaret, our next royal, would bring the conversation into the 20th century, trading Italian villas for London clubs, and replacing whispered scandal with the unmistakable flashbulb certainty of modern tabloid desire. 4. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. She was born into a palace and lived like she was trying to escape it. Princess Margaret, glamorous, mercurial, tragic, and thoroughly inconvenient, was the younger sister in a monarchy that only had room for one queen. Where Elizabeth II came to embody duty, Margaret became its contradiction. Impulsive where Elizabeth was measured, emotional where Elizabeth was composed, and defiant in ways the crown never officially endorsed but could never quite control. From the beginning, Margaret was treated like a decorative afterthought. Not in the cruel sense, but in the unrelenting way the royal machine grinds hierarchy into identity. As second-born, she was royalty without relevance. A spare, technically. Raised in privilege, yes, but also in proximity to a throne she would never occupy, with expectations she was never designed to fulfill. So she didn't. She fulfilled other ones instead. Margaret turned herself into an icon. She smoked, drank, danced, flirted, laughed too loudly at state dinners, and didn't apologize. In the age of ration books and royal protocol, she chose Dior gowns and scandalous friends. In a family famous for restraint, Margaret was a full-volume aria. But behind the cocktails and couture was a recurring theme: the wrong men at the wrong time, for all the right reasons. Peter Townsend was the first, a war hero, a royal equerry, and a married man when they met. He was everything Margaret wasn't: stoic, dutiful, bound by service. But their connection was immediate and impossible to hide. When his divorce was finalized, Margaret wanted to marry him. The British public was tentatively on her side. The Church of England and the government were not. As head of the church, her sister couldn't endorse a marriage to a divorced man. To do so would be to disrupt the entire post-war illusion of moral order. In the end, Margaret gave up Townsend of her own free will, or so the official statement claimed. What she gave up, however, was far more than a man. It was the last time she would let the crown dictate her heart without consequences. She didn't stop falling in love. She just stopped seeking permission. The decades that followed were a carousel of names. Billy Wallace, a pre-approved aristocrat who came close but lacked conviction. Robin Douglas Home, a jazz-loving divorcee with the wrong surname. And Mick Jagger, rumored but never confirmed, which, for Margaret, was half the point. Her relationships became public property, dissected in tabloids and whispered over in drawing rooms. Then came Anthony Armstrong Jones, a commoner, a photographer, and just eccentric enough to be let through the palace gates. Tony, as he was known, represented everything Margaret had longed for: rebellion that passed as modernity, art disguised as decorum. They married in 1960 in the first royal wedding to be televised. It looked like a fairy tale. For about 10 minutes. Behind the scenes, Tony bristled under the weight of his new title, Earl of Snowdon, and Margaret bristled under the illusion that marriage could domesticate desire. Their home life was more vogue spread than nursery rhyme: wild parties, strange guests, separate bedrooms, Mutual resentments. They were compatible in the way fire and oxygen are compatible, until someone chokes. The affairs came, as they always do in stories like this. Margaret found companionship in Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior. Their relationship, complete with holiday photos and paparazzi lenses, ignited public outrage. Margaret, nearing 50, was suddenly reframed not as a rebellious princess, but as a scandalous older woman. The double standards were brutal and effective. But Roddy wasn't a scandal to her. He was comfort, laughter, a late-life experiment in choosing something or someone without permission. They stayed together for years, long after the press moved on, long after her marriage officially collapsed. Margaret aged, but she didn't retreat. She grew thornier, funnier, and more enigmatic. Her sharp wit remained, even as her health began to fracture under the weight of decades spent playing the glamorous martyr. She became, in her final years, both a symbol and a warning. Proof that proximity to power does not equal peace, and that rebellion without escape eventually turns inward. She died in 2002, cremated, the first royal to do so in centuries. A final act of choosing differently. Margaret's love life is often reduced to a tabloid blur, but in truth, it's a tragic narrative in plain sight. A woman born into a world that denied her autonomy, then punished her for seeking it. Every man she loved became another note in the elegy of what could have been if she hadn't been born royal or born second. And if Margaret's story was one of defiance under velvet ropes, then the next royal on our journey wore defiance like armor and celibacy like satire. Because few figures in history have managed to inspire more gossip while remaining officially untouched than Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, who might just have weaponized romance without ever needing to surrender to it. 5. Elizabeth I. They called her the Virgin Queen, but nobody said it with a straight face. Not really. Not the diplomats who watched her toy with suitors like chess pieces. Not the poets who wrote her sonnets so effusive they bordered on indecent. Not the ambassadors who dutifully reported on her smiles, her blushes, her prolonged hand clasps, as though they were military intelligence. Even the courtiers, who were trained in flattery from birth, smirked behind their goblets. Because if Elizabeth I was a virgin, she was the most flirtatious one in Europe, and certainly the most strategically dangerous. But the truth of Elizabeth's love life was both more elusive and more fascinating than the gossip that trailed behind her jeweled train. Her legend is tangled in paradox. A woman who ruled without a king, yet never ruled alone. Who disdained marriage, yet played bride to an entire nation. Who refused intimacy on the record, yet left a wake of hearts, loyal, bruised, and confused. At the center of the rumor hurricane stood Robert Dudley. He was tall, dark, and charismatic in the way that always raises eyebrows. Childhood friend, master of the horse, constant presence in the Queen's orbit. He danced with her, dined with her, rode beside her in hunting parties. He had chambers near hers. He had a wife who died under suspicious circumstances. And he had the distinct misfortune of being the only man Elizabeth may have truly trusted, and thus could never have. The death of Amy Robsart, Dudley's wife, remains one of those historical events coded in enough ambiguity to fuel a dozen novels. She fell down the stairs, they said. An accident, officially. Convenient, whispered the court. Inconvenient, insisted Elizabeth, who knew very well that even the scent of scandal was poison to her rule. She didn't marry Dudley. She couldn't afford to, and perhaps, in her private calculations, she never forgave him for putting her in that position in the first place. But she didn't let him go. Dudley remained a fixture in her life, elevated to Earl of Leicester, assigned to noble causes, honored in public. When he died, she locked herself away and refused food, a woman unraveling privately while maintaining her image with machine-like precision. Of course, Dudley wasn't the only man to orbit the Queen's son. There was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, charming, impulsive, younger, and doomed. He was Dudley's stepson, which already made things Freudian. He fancied himself a military hero, a political thinker, and Elizabeth's rightful favorite. She indulged him at first, perhaps out of nostalgia, perhaps out of boredom. But Essex didn't understand the rules of Elizabeth's affection. It was conditional, strategic, and always performative. When he failed her in Ireland, he returned uninvited and burst into her chambers before she was properly dressed. A scandal not because of impropriety, but because of audacity. She had him executed not long after. It wasn't heartbreak, it was housekeeping. There were others. Christopher Hatton, the dancer with ambition. Walter Raleigh, the explorer who charmed her with tobacco and poetry, and then married her lady-in-waiting in secret, a betrayal she never forgave. Francis Drake, Francis Bacon, Thomas Seymour, names that filled letters and court diaries and ambassadorial reports. Some were lovers in theory. Some were lovers in poetry. Some were simply mirrors that reflected Elizabeth's favorite image of herself. Desirable, unattainable, and always in control. Because that, in the end, was the heart of the mystery. Did Elizabeth love? Certainly. Did she desire? Probably. Did she act on it? That depends entirely on what you consider action. What Elizabeth understood better than any monarch before her, and most after, was that marriage was a trap. Not for women in general, but for her in particular. A queen regnant, ruling alone, could not marry without surrendering part of her power, marry a foreign prince, and risk turning England into a satellite. Marry an English nobleman, and risk civil war. Marry no one, and become the living embodiment of England itself. So she remained single, not out of prudery, but out of ruthless statecraft. She wore virginity like a crown, not a corset. It wasn't about chastity, it was about symbolism. In a world where women were expected to serve, Elizabeth became the one woman who didn't, by pretending she already was. Married to the realm, engaged to God, courted by all, claimed by none. And perhaps that's why her love life remains such fertile ground for speculation. Because it was never private. It was political theater, staged in velvet and lace, with longing glances and diplomatic consequences. Every flirtation was a negotiation. Every smile, a statement of policy. And every time she didn't marry, she reminded the world that she had the rarest power of all, the power to choose. Elizabeth I died childless, successorless, and shrouded in legend. Her memory endures not as a tragic romantic or a pious recluse, but as a queen who played the love game so well she never had to fold. But where Elizabeth refused to share power, the next queen on our descent into dynastic chaos was far less guarded, far more impulsive, and significantly more scandalous. Because Isabella of Angoulême didn't just cause whispers in the royal court, she caused shouts, loud ones, and some of them came from France. 6. Queen Isabella of Angoulême. She arrived in England at the age of 12 and by 13 was married to a king. If this sounds like the beginning of a medieval cautionary tale, that's because it is. Isabella of Angoulême, queen consort to King John of England, has gone down in history not as a tragic victim of child marriage, but as a woman whose adult reputation burst from the shadows like a fire left deliberately unattended. Her legend is not one of innocence lost, but of composure abandoned, and quite possibly of revenge deliberately served in the most satisfying manner the 13th century allowed. Isabella was born into French nobility, the daughter of Count Aymer of Angoulême. Her beauty was noted even in childhood, which, in medieval terms, meant she had political value. She was originally betrothed to Hugh IX de Lusignan, a powerful noble with strong ties to the French crown. That alliance was meant to secure land, loyalty, and keep things comfortably French. But John of England, already infamous for his ungovernable temper and flexible ethics, saw an opportunity. He married her instead. This wasn't a romantic elopement. It was a political theft, a deliberate insult to the Lusignan family, and a reckless swipe at France's sphere of influence. And it set the tone for Isabella's entire reign. Strategic in public, scandalous in private, and always one gesture away from total chaos. John was not, by any account, an ideal husband. He was cruel, paranoid, and deeply unpopular. He waged wars he couldn't finish, taxed everyone into open rebellion, and left behind a trail of grievances that would eventually birth the Magna Carta. As his queen, Isabella was expected to play the part, smile at the right times, bear royal airs, and avoid drawing attention. She did none of that. Instead, she made enemies. And when the opportunity came, she made headlines. After John's death in 1216, Isabella was left a widow at just 28 years old. Most queens at that point would have quietly retired to a nunnery or a countryside estate. Isabella? She returned to France, reclaimed her lands, and did something very few queens in history had dared to do without permission. She remarried for love, or possibly revenge. Her second husband? Hugh X de Lusignan. That's right. The son of the man she was originally betrothed to before John snatched her away. It's unclear whether this was a love match, a political reconciliation, or the most passive-aggressive long game ever executed. What's certain is that it sent shockwaves through both the English and French courts. England, in particular, was appalled. Isabella had not received royal permission for the marriage. A technical formality, yes, but one that held serious legal weight. She was still the Queen Dowager of England, the mother of the young King Henry III. Her remarriage threatened inheritance claims, diplomatic balances, and royal pride. But Isabella did not care. With Hugh X, she ruled a powerful chunk of southwestern France, bore several more children, and, if chroniclers are to be believed, finally lived as she pleased. The French court whispered about her openly. She was described as shameless, domineering, and passionately attached to her favorites. In medieval chronicles, these were not backhanded compliments. They were moral alarms. To describe a woman as shameless was to accuse her of undermining the very idea of monarchy through pleasure. And yet the reports persist. There were rumors, persistent, salacious, never confirmed, of affairs with noblemen, envoys, and knights who found their way into her favor. Chroniclers accused her of ruling not with reason, but with romantic indulgence. She was said to manipulate with glances, to charm with calculated words, to pit suitors against one another like a queen in a game of hearts. Some claimed she used her beauty to sway politics. Others said she simply enjoyed breaking the rules. And then there were those who insisted she was nothing more than a scheming widow who refused to fade into background tapestry like good royal women were supposed to. Whatever the truth, Isabella didn't just remarry, she regained control. She outlived King John by nearly 20 years. She died in France, far from the English court, buried in the abbey she had chosen herself. There was no royal funeral, no ceremonial mourning, no poetic mourning of her place in England's dynasty. In death, as in life, she operated on her own terms. Isabella of Angoulême remains a mystery less for what we don't know and more for what we can't prove. Was she a scandalous queen or a strategic survivor? A passionate rebel or a misunderstood widow? Her reputation depends on which chronicler you believe, and whether you think a woman who marries for power is any different from one who marries for love when the politics happen to align. And speaking of love, power, and scandalously poor timing, the next woman in our royal cavalcade was no stranger to all three. She may not have worn a crown, but she wore the king's favor, and possibly carried his children. Mary Boleyn, sister to a more famously doomed queen, had already made her rounds through the French court before Henry VIII ever noticed her neckline. 7. Mary Boleyn. History tends to treat Mary Boleyn like a footnote, an opening act before the main show. Her younger sister Anne would go on to become queen, spark a national religious schism, and lose her head, literally and politically. Mary, in contrast, is often remembered with a raised eyebrow and a shrug. Ah yes, the chroniclers seem to say, the other Boleyn girl, the one who got there first. But Mary's story, when peeled from the edges of her sister's legend, is a tale of charm without caution, desire without agenda, and a life that both scandalized and quietly outlived an era obsessed with appearances. She began, as many noble girls did, in a carefully orchestrated orbit around power. The Boleyn family, ambitious and sharply attuned to courtly opportunity, sent Mary to the French court in her teens. There she was meant to absorb language, polish, and perhaps a strategic amount of mischief. And in France, where court life blurred the line between diplomacy and seduction, Mary reportedly flourished. And by flourished, we mean courtiers started writing her name into the margins of their letters. Rumors swirled of affairs with French nobles. Some claim she became mistress to Francis I himself, who allegedly referred to her with the kind of nickname that suggests familiarity, but not necessarily respect. When she returned to England, she was attractive, worldly, and already known as experienced, a word that in Tudor terms translated to both desirable and problematic, which is precisely the combination that would have caught Henry VIII's attention. The king was already practiced in the art of courtly pursuit, and Mary, already married to courtier William Carey, was conveniently positioned. The details of their relationship remain murky. No love letters, no direct evidence, no private diary entries signed with trembling declarations. But the timing of Mary's 2 children, born during her marriage to Carey, raised more than one courtly eyebrow. Unofficially, it was whispered that Henry may have fathered one or both. Officially, the king never acknowledged them. And unlike his later mistresses, Mary didn't receive grand titles or estates. No jewels, no mansions, no permanent place in the royal memory vault. Which makes her affair with the king all the more fascinating. Because unlike Anne, who famously withheld affection until a crown was in sight, Mary seemed to offer hers freely. She wasn't a seductress with a plan. She was, by most accounts, warm-hearted, open, and utterly uncalculating. And in a court addicted to intrigue, that made her dangerous in a different way. Not because she plotted, but because she didn't. Her family, of course, was deeply invested in the game. The Boleyns were climbers, and they used every rung, moral or otherwise. When Anne caught Henry's eye, Mary faded strategically into the background. No royal protest, no public scandal. She stepped aside and let her sister ascend, even as it must have stung to watch Anne succeed where she had been dismissed. But Mary's quiet rebellion came later, and it was subtle, almost gentle. She married for love. After Anne became queen and Henry's affections turned icy, Mary reappeared at court, not as a player, but as a liability. She had married William Stafford, a soldier with no title and even less wealth. This was unacceptable. For a Boleyn, and especially for one who had once been the king's lover, marrying below your station without permission was more than embarrassing. It was treasonous to the family's ambition. She was banished from court. Her family turned its back. Anne, now queen, refused to support her. And yet Mary, in exile, finally seemed to find something resembling peace. Her letters from that period speak not of regret, but of contentment. "I had rather beg my bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom," she reportedly wrote. A line that reads now as either the most romantic thing ever penned or the most devastating critique of court life from someone who had seen too much of it. Mary lived long enough to watch her sister rise and fall, spectacularly. She watched Anne marry the king, bear him a daughter, and then be tried for treason in a court that didn't even bother to keep up the appearance of fairness. When Anne died, the family collapsed in on itself, but Mary, banished and forgotten, survived. In the end, that might be Mary Boleyn's strangest legacy. She lived, No executioner's block, no political downfall, no international incident. Just a quiet life in the countryside with a husband she chose, children she raised, and a name that, centuries later, still clings to royal scandal like perfume on parchment. And if Mary's story is one of escape, of slipping through the cracks before they swallowed her whole, then the next woman did the opposite. She climbed to the very top of the power pyramid, only to be remembered, if remembered at all. Not for the crown she wore, but for the relationships she couldn't quite keep secret. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, ruled kingdoms, but may have ruled her heart with far less certainty. 8. Queen Anne. History doesn't always know what to do with Queen Anne. She reigned over the Union of England and Scotland, led her country through major wars, and oversaw the political transformation that laid the groundwork for Britain's modern parliamentary system. And yet, when people remember her, if they remember her, it's usually through whispers. Not about her statesmanship, not about the Act of Union, not even about her 17 tragic pregnancies. No, they remember Anne because of her affections, the intensity of them, the rumor of them, and the women who surrounded her like shadows, sharp, loyal, and, depending on whom you asked, possibly lovers. Anne was never the archetypal royal beauty. She wasn't draped in seduction like her predecessors. She wasn't scandalous in the obvious ways. No midnight affairs, no shocking love children, no provocative portraits hidden behind velvet drapes. What made Anne controversial was something subtler, and in its way, more unsettling. She felt things, deeply, openly, sometimes irrationally, and when she loved, she didn't love halfway. Her early years were marked by instability, political, personal, physical. She grew up in the shadow of the Restoration, a time when court morality was more of a suggestion than a rule. Her father, James II, would later be deposed for his Catholicism. Anne herself remained Protestant, partly by conviction, partly by necessity. Her loyalties were always pragmatic, but her emotions were anything but. When she married Prince George of Denmark, it was not a union of passion. George was affable, unremarkable, and occasionally mocked by courtiers for his near invisibility. Yet, in Anne's world, he was safe. She remained loyal to him all her life. But while George may have been her husband, the emotional center of her world was often elsewhere. Enter Sarah Churchill. Sarah wasn't just Anne's friend. She was her confidant, her advisor, her political proxy, and possibly the most emotionally significant figure in Anne's life. They met as teenagers and quickly became inseparable. Sarah was clever, ambitious, and sharp-tongued. Everything Anne wasn't. Where Anne was cautious and shy, Sarah was bold and commanding. She didn't just advise the Queen, she steered her. The letters between them are intimate in tone and often startling in language. Anne called Sarah Mrs. Freeman. Sarah called Anne Mrs. Morley, a code used to equalize their roles, to suggest a friendship unencumbered by royalty. In an age where women's writing was restrained, their correspondence dripped with emotion. Some of Anne's letters to Sarah border on romantic desperation. She writes of missing her, of longing for her presence, of feeling wounded by distance. Were they lovers? It depends on whom you ask. Contemporary gossip said yes, though that same gossip also believed any intense female friendship must be unnatural. Historians today remain divided. Some read their bond as emotional dependence, others as coded intimacy. What's certain is this: Anne's attachment to Sarah was real, consuming, and ultimately unsustainable. Because Sarah, brilliant though she was, didn't know when to stop. She pushed too hard, demanded too much, insulted Anne's husband, criticized her political decisions, and grew increasingly condescending. Power made Sarah arrogant, Anne stubborn. Their friendship began to erode slowly, and then all at once. And just as Sarah was fading, someone else stepped in. Abigail Hill. Abigail was Sarah's cousin, originally placed in Anne's household through Sarah's patronage. But where Sarah had dominated Anne, Abigail soothed her. She was quiet, gentle, unassuming, and crucially, she listened. Anne, weary of Sarah's fire, began to turn toward Abigail's warmth. This shift ignited an all-out emotional war. Sarah accused Abigail of manipulating the queen, of seducing her, of plotting with political enemies. She weaponized rumor, claiming Abigail's rise was fueled by intimacy unbecoming of a monarch. Pamphlets began to circulate. Cartoons appeared. The idea of Anne as a monarch enthralled by a handmaid sent ripples through the fragile dignity of royal court life. Anne, for her part, refused to take the bait. She never confirmed or denied the nature of her relationships. She simply remained silent, loyal to Abigail to the end, even after dismissing Sarah in a political blaze that scorched reputations on both sides. By the time Anne died in 1714, her body was broken, her legacy uncertain, and her personal relationships still the subject of speculation. 17 pregnancies, no surviving heirs, and a heart divided between duty and devotion. She left behind a united kingdom, but no clear successor to her affections. Only the lingering question of what her heart had truly wanted, and whether she'd ever really had the chance to claim it. If Anne's mystery lies in her emotional entanglements, coded, whispered, endlessly interpreted, then the next queen on our descent into royal intrigue leaves even fewer written clues. Henrietta Maria of France, wife of Charles I, stood at the center of one of England's bloodiest chapters. And somewhere between rebellion and religion, the rumors about her relationships began to flicker. Delicate at first, then dangerous. 9. Henrietta Maria of France. Henrietta Maria of France entered England with a crown on her head and suspicion in the air. She was Catholic. She was French. She was 15. And she had just married a Protestant king of a Protestant country that hadn't yet figured out how to separate religion from national paranoia. Queen consort to Charles I, Henrietta Maria was everything England claimed not to want, wrapped in silk, pearls, and a lineage that traced itself back to centuries of Bourbon pride. And yet, for a woman so reviled by pamphleteers and Puritans, she captured attention with a skill that seemed less deliberate than gravitational. Wherever Henrietta Maria went, palace, chapel, theater, battlefield, the rumors followed like a procession, carefully dressed, whispering in a dozen dialects. They whispered of her politics, her priestly entourage, her hidden chapels, her private letters, and of course, they whispered about her lovers. Now, officially, Henrietta Maria was a devoted wife. She and Charles shared something rare for royals of their era, mutual affection. Despite their early communication struggles, she spoke almost no English, and he none of her French emotional shorthand. They found their rhythm. She bore him 9 children. They exchanged thoughtful gifts, long letters, and the sort of shared glances that artists were paid handsomely to immortalize. But affection was not immunity, not in a court where factionalism could kill faster than illness, not in a kingdom where every queen was watched and every foreign queen was accused. From the moment she arrived in England, Henrietta Maria was criticized for being too close to her favorites, a term that, in 17th century court life, could mean anything from confidant to clandestine companion. She maintained a French household, filled with musicians, priests, artists, secretaries, and the occasional handsome envoy with excellent posture. Her inner circle was seen not just as a foreign influence, but as a personal indulgence. And indulgence, to the Puritan-leaning public, was practically a sin. One name rose above the rest: Henry Jermyn. An English courtier who had served under her from the early 1630s, Jermyn was charming, composed, and just ambitious enough to remain useful without threatening the balance of power. He was often described as devoted to the Queen. He handled her correspondence. He managed her private affairs. He appeared in her chambers frequently. Too frequently, if one believed the whispers. German accompanied her into exile during the English Civil War. He remained by her side in Paris, helping her organize royalist support, raise funds, and maneuver through the hostile corridors of foreign courts. The level of intimacy, emotional, political, and physical proximity was undeniable. What was never confirmed and never publicly acknowledged was whether that intimacy crossed into romance. But that didn't stop the rumors. Even among royalists, whispers surfaced that one of her younger children looked a bit too much like German. Her enemies, already eager to paint her as an enemy of Protestant virtue, had a field day. Political cartoons were etched with scenes of veiled meetings and suggestive gestures. Pamphlets framed her not just as a manipulative queen, but as a woman ruled by passion rather than statecraft. Other names floated around too. French nobles, exiled courtiers, gallant Catholic officers who attended her private masses or escorted her through the dark hallways of foreign castles. Nothing was proven. But in some ways, nothing needed to be. The sheer existence of a royal woman with autonomy and secrets was enough to animate the scandal machine for decades. And Henrietta Maria, for her part, refused to play the game on anyone else's terms. She was fiercely loyal to her religion, to her husband, to the idea of monarchy itself. She saw her queenship not as decoration, but as vocation. She wrote letters laced with political strategy. She corresponded with foreign leaders, leveraged her continental connections, and in exile, campaigned tirelessly for the restoration of her family's rule. But even loyalty can be reframed. Her religious devotion was described as fanaticism, her close friendships as impropriety. Her emotional expressiveness, so natural in her native France, was read as manipulation by a nation that preferred its queens reserved and silent. When Charles I was captured, tried, and executed in 1649, Henrietta Maria's role as queen was extinguished in England, but not in her own mind. She never stopped referring to herself as queen. She never gave up on her son's restoration. She watched, from the sidelines of Europe, as Cromwell rose, then fell, and the monarchy crept back under Charles II. She returned to England briefly, older, quieter, still scrutinized. The rumors had quieted by then, softened by time, and overshadowed by newer scandals. But the mystery remained. Who had she really loved? Had she mourned Charles alone? Or were there others, veiled behind court protocol and diplomatic necessity, who had held her affection just as closely? Henrietta Maria died in France in 1669. Her legacy remains complicated. To royalists, she was a loyal wife and mother of kings. To parliamentarians, a dangerous influence. And to history, a queen who blurred the line between private affection and public power with such skill that we're still asking centuries later, did she rule from behind the curtain, or did she simply light it on fire? And if Henrietta Maria carried suspicion like perfume, then Queen Victoria, stoic, mournful, and endlessly mythologized, wore hers like a black veil. Her reign was long, proper, and rigid. But even within the fortress of formality, there were two men whose presence sparked whispers: John Brown and Abdul Karim, one Scottish, one Indian, both outsiders, and both perhaps more intimate companions than the crown was ever willing to admit. 10. Queen Victoria. For someone who became a symbol of moral rectitude, Queen Victoria spent a surprising amount of time surrounded by rumors. Not loud ones, not scandalous headlines or midnight scandals, but the quiet, enduring kind of rumors that sink into the wallpaper and linger in royal biographies like a perfume no one admits wearing. She was the emblem of restraint, the guardian of decency, the matriarch of an empire that painted virtue in stained glass and marble. And yet, behind the mourning clothes and royal portraits, there existed two men whose relationships with her continued to provoke uncomfortable questions: John Brown and Abdul Karim. Victoria's reign lasted more than 60 years. In that time, she buried her husband, wore widow's black for the rest of her life, oversaw the expansion of the British Empire, and perfected the art of looking unimpressed in every photograph. But for all the public discipline, her private life was never entirely hers. Every word, every gesture, every favor given or name mentioned was noted, analyzed, and, when possible, judged. The first man to invite serious judgment was John Brown. He was a Scottish servant, technically her personal gillie, who began serving her during her prolonged mourning after the death of Prince Albert. Victoria was devastated by Albert's passing in 1861. She withdrew from court life, wore black, refused public appearances, and wrote sorrow-soaked diary entries in longhand that read like emotional exiles. Her ministers despaired. The people complained. And into this national gloom stepped Brown, unbothered by court etiquette, immune to whisper campaigns, and in possession of exactly the kind of emotional practicality that grieving monarchs rarely encounter. Brown wasn't polished. He didn't bow enough. He drank too much. He spoke plainly, sometimes rudely, and often called the Queen simply woman, a familiarity that would have gotten almost anyone else imprisoned, or at least fired. Victoria instead seemed delighted. She called him my dear Highlander. She gave him medals. She defended him against her ministers. She built cottages near Balmoral where they could ride together in the countryside, far from the stifling expectations of Buckingham Palace. Was it romantic? The court certainly thought so. Members of the royal household began referring to him as the Queen's Stallion behind closed doors. Pamphlets accused them of secret marriage. Anonymous letters claimed Brown had private access to the Queen's chambers. And yet, despite years of speculation, there is no definitive proof that the relationship ever crossed into physical intimacy. Victoria never confessed it. Brown never claimed it. If there was more than companionship, they took it to their graves with the same quiet tenacity that defined their time together. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria grieved deeply. She commissioned a statue in his honor. Against the advice of nearly everyone, she preserved his room. She kept his portrait in her bedroom, even when her children objected. One of her daughters destroyed some of Victoria's letters to Brown after her death, citing inappropriate expressions. But again, interpretation does most of the heavy lifting here. To some, Brown was a loyal servant who helped a lonely widow survive. To others, he was something more. A reminder that emotional needs don't vanish just because someone is wearing a crown. And then came Abdul Karim. In 1887, 4 years after Brown's death, Karim arrived from India to serve as a personal attendant. He was young, dignified, and spoke Hindi and Urdu. Victoria was instantly intrigued. She called him the Munshi, teacher, and within weeks he was seated beside her at meals, walking with her on palace grounds, and writing her long notes in flowing Urdu script. She appointed him her official Indian secretary. She gave him gifts, land, titles. She took lessons in Urdu. She sent his family presents and insisted that he be treated with the same deference as high-ranking courtiers. The backlash was swift and vicious. The royal household objected. Politicians objected. Her own children objected. The idea of a Muslim servant from a colonized country having daily access to the Queen of England was more than impolite. It was, in their minds, a political threat wrapped in personal eccentricity. But Victoria stood firm. She ignored their complaints. She recorded her admiration for Karim in her journals. She celebrated his intelligence, his character, and what she called his delightful company. Again, the question looms. Was there something more? The evidence, once again, is frustratingly inconclusive. There are no love letters, no declarations, no scandalous testimonies, only gestures, loyalties, and the unmistakable rhythm of a relationship that transcended the cold formalities of service. When Victoria died in 1901, The first person her attendants tried to remove from the royal residences was Karim. They confiscated his correspondence. They burned his letters. They sent him back to India, erasing him from palace life as efficiently as possible. But they couldn't erase the impression he made. Victoria's affections for Brown and Karim weren't about rebellion. They were about relief. These weren't politically advantageous men. They weren't noble-born or socially acceptable. But they were, in some deep and stubborn way, hers. In a world that demanded her loyalty to tradition, they reminded her of the possibility of loyalty to something simpler: trust, comfort, affection. And so the queen who defined Victorian morality, who was supposed to stand above desire, and certainly outside gossip, ended up surrounded by both. Two men, two relationships, two ongoing mysteries that even history hasn't quite managed to solve. And if Victoria's rumored romances were shrouded in discretion and soft loyalty, the next queen played by very different rules. Elizabeth Woodville, mother to princes, widow to a Lancastrian, wife to a York, didn't wait for affection to arrive politely. She made her own fate. And the list of men she left behind in the process? More than one court poet chose not to put it in writing. 11. Queen Elizabeth Woodville. If medieval England had a list of women who weren't supposed to end up queens, Elizabeth Woodville would have topped it twice. She was a commoner, a widow, and worst of all, a Lancastrian. By the logic of 15th century royal politics, her proper place was far from the throne, preferably behind a tapestry somewhere, politely grieving her dead husband and knitting gratitude into silence. But Elizabeth was not one to linger in doorways or wait for approval. She had other ideas, dangerous ones, and the first man who underestimated her ended up marrying her. His name was Edward IV, King of England. Their story has been romanticized for centuries, spun into a tale of love at first sight. A beautiful widow standing under a tree by the roadside, pleading for her son's inheritance, catching the eye of the young, impulsive king. Whether that's true or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that a woman with no royal bloodline, no foreign alliance, and no powerful family at court managed to capture the most eligible bachelor in Christendom, and then made it stick. They married in secret. Edward knew the backlash would be fierce. His advisors had already handpicked a foreign bride for him, and Elizabeth, daughter of Sir Richard Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was not on the list. When the marriage was finally revealed, the court practically choked. Nobles were outraged. His closest ally, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, was so furious he switched sides and started a war. Elizabeth, for her part, didn't flinch. She stepped into her queenship with regal poise and a sense of vengeance dressed as practicality. She moved her family into power like knights on a chessboard. Her brothers and sisters married into noble houses. Her sons were given titles. Her daughters were positioned like glittering baubles on the national mantle. She was building something, not just a dynasty, but a fortress. Because Elizabeth knew something most people didn't. Love had won her the crown, but it wouldn't keep her safe. And perhaps that's why the rumors started. Even before she became queen, Elizabeth had a reputation at court, not for sin or scandal, but for being captivating. She was tall, striking, with silver blonde hair and a self-possession that unnerved men who expected deference. Her first husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting for the Lancastrian cause. But before, during, and possibly after that marriage, Elizabeth had suitors. Not just admirers, but persistent noblemen, political agents, and knights whose devotion blurred the line between loyalty and longing. After her marriage to Edward IV, the whispers intensified. Men in her orbit began to attract suspicion. Handsome courtiers, trusted retainers, foreign diplomats who paid her too many compliments. Was she merely gracious, or was she leveraging affection for advantage? One chronicler accused her of fostering familiarity among those beneath her, a phrase so conveniently vague it could mean anything from casual flirtation to clandestine trysts. And then there were the rumors that the king himself sometimes questioned her loyalty. Edward was no stranger to infidelity. He collected mistresses like military banners, but he was said to be possessive, especially when his affection for Elizabeth flared into paranoia. At court, whispers swirled about her closeness with certain male attendants, about late-night meetings, about gifts exchanged and loyalties bought with more than coin. Nothing was ever proven. Of course it wasn't. Proof would have required witnesses willing to accuse a queen, and few were foolish enough to try. But the rumors lingered, particularly after Edward's death. Left widowed with several children and a dangerously uncertain political future, Elizabeth's influence became both her weapon and her weakness. She attempted to secure power through strategic marriages. She pushed for her daughter, Elizabeth of York, to marry the new king, Henry VII. She maneuvered her sons into positions of strength. And then, famously, those sons vanished. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were taken into custody by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, supposedly for their protection. They were never seen again. Some blame Richard III, others suspect the Tudors. A smaller, darker faction of speculation asks whether Elizabeth herself knew more than she admitted. It's an unsettling theory, but not a new one. The idea that Elizabeth might have been both a grieving mother and a calculating survivor isn't incompatible. This was a woman who had already risen from widowhood to queenship. She had survived betrayal, rebellion, and the death of her husband. She had outplayed noblemen who had underestimated her. To think she wouldn't consider every option to preserve her remaining children's futures is to ignore everything we know about her. Later in life, Elizabeth was removed from court by Henry VII. He didn't trust her, maybe because of her connections to the old nobility, maybe because she knew too much, maybe because she had played the game too well for too long, and men like Henry preferred their queens and dowagers to be silent, ornamental, and just a little bit forgotten. She died in relative obscurity. No royal burial, no fanfare, just the quiet end of a woman whose beauty had launched a dynasty and whose name would forever carry the scent of court ambition and lingering suspicion. And if Elizabeth Woodville blurred the line between queen and conspirator, then Catherine Parr, the last of Henry VIII's 6 wives, lived in a world where that line didn't just blur, it shifted beneath her feet. Because for Catherine, love wasn't a scandal. It was a risk, especially when the man she truly wanted wasn't the one on the throne. 12. Catherine Parr. By the time Catherine Parr married Henry VIII, she had already buried 2 husbands, survived a court riddled with ambition and instability, and mastered the political art of quiet endurance. She was 31, twice widowed, unusually educated, and wise enough to know that love at court was often a liability dressed as privilege. When she became queen, she wore the crown like armor. But underneath it, Catherine Parr was a woman who had already loved, might have loved again, and, if timing had been kinder, might have loved differently. Unlike Henry's earlier wives, Catherine didn't enter the marriage as a young noblewoman dazzled by power. She entered it as a seasoned survivor. Her first marriage, to Edward Berg, was short and largely uneventful. Her second, to John Neville, Lord Latimer, brought her deeper into the political storm of the Tudor court. Latimer was a man of influence and volatility. He dragged her into uprisings and scandal, leaving her to manage not only his estate, but his reputation. She did both with remarkable efficiency, earning a name for herself as capable, discreet, and well-versed in managing chaos. By 1543, with Henry VIII's 5th wife executed and the king's health in visible decline, Catherine caught his attention. Her intelligence, her composure, and her ability to soothe egos, not just his, made her an ideal candidate for the crown. But there was one small complication. She was already in love. Thomas Seymour, brother to the late Jane Seymour and uncle to the future Edward VI, was everything Henry wasn't. young, dashing, charming, and notoriously ambitious. The relationship between Catherine and Thomas may have been more than courtly affection. Letters suggest an emotional bond strong enough that marriage was being discussed before the king intervened. Henry proposed, and Catherine, understanding the implications of refusal, accepted. To the outside world, Catherine was the picture of queenly virtue. She embraced the role of stepmother to Henry's children with sincere affection. She worked to reconcile Elizabeth and Mary with their father, restoring them to the line of succession. She took an active role in court affairs, even acting as regent when Henry waged war in France. She encouraged religious reform and published theological works under her own name, unheard of for a queen at the time. But beneath her carefully measured poise, there was always the presence of Thomas Seymour, waiting, watching, waiting again. Henry died in 1547, and within months, Catherine married Seymour in what was either a spontaneous union of long-delayed affection or a very calculated power move. Possibly both. The marriage was secret at first, which did nothing to quiet the gossip. For all her outward propriety, Catherine had now married a man widely regarded as dangerously ambitious. And she had done it swiftly enough to make even her supporters pause. Their relationship, once public, became complicated almost immediately. Catherine was deeply in love, it seems, but also increasingly aware that Seymour's ambitions might exceed his loyalty. He courted favor with the young King Edward VI, flirted outrageously with the teenage Princess Elizabeth, and tried to carve out a role for himself in the Regency government. Catherine, pregnant for the first time in her life, found herself in the uncomfortable position of being both wife and political liability. Her household, once admired, became the center of scandal. Elizabeth, then just 14, was removed from her care amid rumors that Seymour's attentions were becoming inappropriate. Catherine, ever the strategist, managed the situation with restraint. But the cracks were visible. She gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, in 1548. Days later, Catherine died, ostensibly from complications related to childbirth. Her death was quiet, sudden, and oddly convenient for those who found her recent choices disruptive. Seymour didn't mourn long. Within a year, he was arrested for treason, accused of plotting to marry Elizabeth and overthrow the Lord Protector. Executed in 1549, he left behind no legacy, only wreckage. Catherine's legacy, however, is different. She is often remembered as the nurse queen, the one who cared for an aging king and brought his fractured family back together. But that image flattens her. It erases the woman who navigated complex emotional landscapes, who risked her reputation for love, and who, despite knowing exactly how dangerous court life could be, still dared to follow her heart, if only for a brief, burning season. And while Catherine's romance was buried in respectability, the next royal in our descent into mystery had no such cover. Anne Boleyn, the most infamous of Henry's wives, was all intrigue and edge from the start. With her, everything was spectacle, the seduction, the marriage, the downfall. And according to those who lived to write about it, the list of men who fell under her spell may have been longer than the king could bear. 13. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn never just entered a room. She arrived like a rumor. Sharp eyes, sharper tongue, and a presence that unnerved everyone who had learned to navigate court life by silence and smiles. She wasn't the most conventionally beautiful woman in Henry VIII's court, and she didn't need to be. Her power didn't rest in softness. It rested in timing, intelligence, and a mastery of flirtation so precise it was almost mathematical. She knew when to speak, when to turn her head just slightly, when to look back over her shoulder and let a moment last too long. But Anne's story didn't begin with kings or executions. Before she became the most infamous wife in English history, she was simply another noblewoman climbing the precarious ladder of European court life. One glance, one dance, one compliment at a time. Her education began in the Netherlands and France, where she absorbed courtly refinement like a second language. She learned to speak French, play music, write poetry, and, perhaps most importantly, how to navigate male attention without appearing to invite it. By the time she returned to England in her early 20s, Anne was not just cultured, she was calculated. She understood the performance of charm, and she wielded it like a weapon. Before Henry, there were others. Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, was her first serious entanglement. Young, noble, and very much not approved by either his family or the court. Their relationship sparked enough concern that Cardinal Wolsey himself intervened to end it. Rumors swirled of a pre-contract, a kind of informal engagement that, if proven later, would become a legally damning problem. Anne never forgave Wolsey for ending it. She never forgot either. Then there was Thomas Wyatt, a court poet who knew better than to fall in love but did anyway. His poems, full of veiled longing and bitter distance, hint at a woman who captivated him and eluded him in equal measure. Historians still debate whether they had a physical relationship or whether Anne kept him dangling on the edge of hope. Either way, his affection lingered, carefully encrypted in stanzas and metaphors. But it wasn't until Henry VIII noticed her that Anne's story twisted into something darker. Unlike her sister Mary, who had been the king's mistress with little long-term consequence, Anne refused to be disposable. She turned down Henry's gifts, rejected his invitations, and delayed any romantic progress for years. In doing so, she turned desire into obsession. Henry pursued her not just with passion, but with bureaucracy. He began the process of annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a decision that would dismantle England's relationship with the Catholic Church and redefine monarchy itself. And all because Anne didn't say yes too soon. When they finally married in 1533, Anne was already pregnant. She had won, or so it seemed. Her time as queen was short but unforgettable. She was never universally loved. The court was divided between those who admired her wit and those who muttered about her arrogance. She had enemies in every corner, some of them quiet, some of them writing letters to the Pope. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but failed to deliver a male heir. This was her first real political mistake, though biologically it wasn't a mistake at all. Still, the king's patience began to thin. And Anne, always volatile in her cleverness, did not become more submissive. She became sharper, more outspoken, more willing to challenge the men around her, including Henry. Then came the downfall, fast, brutal, and suspiciously tidy. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. Her supposed lovers included her brother George Boleyn and several courtiers, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, William Brereton, and Henry Norris. The trials were rushed. Evidence was shaky. Witnesses were questionable. The dates provided for her supposed affairs were, in some cases, physically impossible. But none of that mattered. The accusations were useful, and the outcome was predetermined. Did Anne actually commit adultery? It's one of the great historical questions. Most modern scholars say no, citing the implausibility of the charges and the political motivations behind them. But what matters isn't whether she did. What matters is that people were willing to believe she could. Because Anne didn't play the role of the silent, obedient queen. She argued, she flirted, she remembered names. She didn't erase her past to suit her crown. And in a court where power was supposed to be inherited, not seized through wit and audacity that made her dangerous, she died on a scaffold in the Tower of London, calmly and with elegance. She wore gray and red, dignified to the end. In her final words, she praised the king, not because she believed it, but because she knew that dying with grace was her last act of control. And yet, Anne Boleyn's legacy is far from finished. Her daughter would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Her story would be retold again and again, reshaped into tragedy, romance, propaganda, and rebellion. But Anne wasn't the only queen who married for power and found betrayal waiting on the other side. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen, and Mother of Kings, had lovers rumored across 3 courts, crusades, and 2 continents. And if Anne was destroyed by her reputation, Eleanor seemed to feed on hers. 14. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just marry kings, she made them. She lived in a time when queens were expected to breed heirs and then disappear politely into the background, speaking only when the priest or the coronation choir invited them to. Eleanor did not vanish. She ruled. She wrote. She traveled. She divorced one king and married another, launching dynasties and rebellions in her wake. And along the way, she gathered rumors like a cloak, each one layered with lust, politics, or poetry. Born in the early 12th century, Eleanor inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine at just 15, making her one of the wealthiest and most eligible women in Europe. She was raised in a court that celebrated chivalry, music, and courtly love, where poetry replaced sermons, and flirtation was considered an art form, not a sin. Her education was steeped in troubadour culture, where nobles praised their ladies' beauty with elaborate verses, and love was meant to be unattainable, passionate, and at least a little bit scandalous. When she married Louis VII of France, it seemed like a match made for legend, the most powerful duchess in Europe with the king of the Franks. But within a few years, it became obvious they had nothing in common. Louis was pious, hesitant, and uncomfortable with displays of excess. Eleanor was none of those things. Their marriage began to unravel during the Second Crusade, when Eleanor insisted on accompanying Louis to the Holy Land. She arrived not as a meek queen trailing behind a royal procession, but as a leader with her own household, advisors, and opinions. At one point, she even proposed leading her own troops, a suggestion that scandalized Louis's court and inspired whispers across Christendom. And then came Raymond of Antioch. Raymond, Eleanor's uncle by blood but closer to her age than her husband, was the handsome, charismatic ruler of a key Crusader state. He welcomed Eleanor with open arms, perhaps too open, according to some chroniclers. Their close relationship, long conversations, private meetings, a shared political outlook, was enough to spark rumors of an affair. Whether or not it happened is still debated, but the scandal alone was enough to poison the already fractured royal marriage. When Louis insisted on continuing the crusade, Eleanor refused. She wanted to stay in Antioch. Some said she wanted to stay with Raymond. Ultimately, Louis forced her to leave. The expedition collapsed. Their relationship did too. Back in France, the marriage officially ended. Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir didn't help her cause, but neither did her independence. Louis and Eleanor's annulment was granted in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity, a common legal excuse for politically inconvenient divorces. She regained Aquitaine and, remarkably, avoided being imprisoned, exiled, or removed from power. Most women in her position would have been quietly erased. Eleanor became more powerful. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. The speed of this second marriage raised immediate eyebrows. Had they been corresponding before her annulment? Had they arranged the alliance while she was still married to Louis? Was Eleanor orchestrating her own political redemption? Probably. Henry was younger than Eleanor, fiery, intelligent, and ambitious. Their early years together were a rare display of royal collaboration. She gave him not just wealth but credibility, and he gave her England. Together, they had 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John. It should have been the perfect union. It wasn't. As Henry grew more controlling, Eleanor grew more distant. He had mistresses, Rosamond Clifford chief among them, and Eleanor, unlike her predecessors, didn't keep silent. Tensions escalated into open rebellion. She backed her sons in their revolt against their father. Henry responded by imprisoning her for nearly 16 years. But even in confinement, Eleanor's legend grew. During her time as queen and later queen dowager, rumors of her lovers multiplied. Troubadours wrote of her liaisons with knights and poets. Some claimed she had taken lovers before her marriage to Louis. Others insisted she continued the practice during her years in England, taking solace in the arms of courtiers while Henry pursued his own affairs. No names ever stuck with certainty, but that didn't stop the stories. They said she ruled not just with strategy but with seduction, that her court at Poitiers had become a theater of love where she played both playwright and leading lady. Eleanor outlived both her husbands and most of her children. She survived wars, betrayals, imprisonment, and scandal. When Richard became king, she ruled as regent in his absence, negotiating with enemies, managing alliances, and refusing, even at 70, to be sidelined. To this day, she remains a towering figure not just in politics, but in mystery. Did she truly love Raymond of Antioch? Were the troubadour's poems biographical or merely aspirational? Was her court a den of illicit romance, or just a place where women were finally allowed to speak? Whatever the truth, Eleanor lived like a woman unconcerned with permission. And if she ruled her passions with the same precision she ruled her lands, then the next royal, Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, offers a more modern scandal. Because in the age of photography and parliament, her rumored lovers weren't knights and counts, they were sculptors, painters, and possibly the staff. 15. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise was the daughter of a queen, the sister of a king, and according to some, much more than the quiet artist history tried to make her. Born in 1848 as the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Louise was supposed to be a symbol of cultured royalty. She was meant to be accomplished, tasteful, and controlled. And she was, at least on paper. She studied sculpture, spoke several languages, and fulfilled her royal duties with the required grace. But beneath the marble busts and charitable appearances lived a woman who resisted containment in every form. If Victoria was the ideal of repressed monarchy, Louise was its breach, a royal who wanted something messier, something freer. Her art wasn't a pastime, it was a statement. In an era when royal daughters were groomed for decorative usefulness, Louise pushed into male-dominated spaces. She exhibited her sculptures publicly. She designed memorials and became the first royal to study at the National Art Training School. And reportedly, she became quite close to her instructors. Her most controversial relationship was with Joseph Edgar Boehm, a prominent sculptor of the day who was more than just a mentor. Boehm was charming, well-connected, and conveniently married, qualities that in royal circles often meant acceptable to be alone with, as long as no one gets ideas. But people got ideas anyway. Louise visited Boehm frequently. She worked with him in his studio, traveled with him to exhibitions, and spent far more time in his company than protocol technically allowed. The gossip became difficult to ignore. Boehm's sudden death in 1890 didn't help, especially since, as one version of the story goes, Louise was allegedly present when he died. The details are unclear. Some said she was found in his studio. Others claim she was seen leaving just before his body was discovered. No official report ever clarified the matter, and the royal household swiftly moved to contain the narrative. Boehm was buried with honor. Louise withdrew for a time. The scandal faded, but never entirely disappeared, and Boehm wasn't the only name tied to Louise. Before her marriage, there were whispers about her closeness to various gentlemen of the court. One of the more persistent rumors was that she had a relationship with her brother's tutor. Another rumor claimed that she gave birth to an illegitimate child while still unmarried, a claim the palace treated with the kind of cold silence that only makes things more intriguing. There was never formal proof, but records of royal staff mysteriously reassigned and payments quietly issued suggested something had happened behind the silk curtains. Then came her marriage. In 1871, Louise married John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, later the Duke of Argyll. It was a groundbreaking match. She was the first daughter of a monarch to marry a non-royal in over 300 years. The union was presented as modern, democratic, and refreshingly practical. But the reality was far less polished. Lorne was a rising politician and writer, educated and refined. But the marriage was more strategic than romantic. The couple struggled to connect. They had no children, rarely lived together for long, and over time, maintained separate social lives. There were whispers about Lorne's preferences, whispers that Louise, discreet but not blind, was well aware of. Their relationship was civil but distant, and both seemed to live more fully outside of it. Louise filled her life with art, travel, and carefully chosen company. Her correspondence was warm, intimate, and at times suspiciously affectionate towards certain male friends, painters, architects, actors. The palace never confirmed anything, but neither did they deny. Louise had a gift for wrapping rebellion in refinement. She said little publicly but lived with a freedom that seemed almost unroyal. She also carried herself with a kind of self-directed mystery. While her siblings were often governed by the weight of their mother's grief and formality, Louise resisted. She challenged her mother's authority. She championed feminist causes, supported women's education, and refused to be reduced to ornament. When Victoria objected to Louise's lifestyle, Louise simply ignored her. And yet, she never abandoned her royal role entirely. She fulfilled her duties with enough grace to avoid expulsion and enough distance to remain untamed. She was the paradox of a princess who obeyed just enough to be tolerated and defied just enough to be remembered. When she died in 1939 at the age of 91, she left behind no confirmed scandals, no confessions, no memoirs of royal secrets, just fragments. A few lingering rumors, a marble statue of Queen Victoria in Kensington, a whisper of something more behind the brushstrokes in bronze. And if Louise sculpted her independence from within the walls of royalty, then Lady Caroline Lamb carved hers out with fire and scandal. She wasn't born royal, but she married into the aristocracy, and her affairs, especially one with a certain Lord Byron, burned hot enough to melt the cold composure of every palace she walked into. 16. Lady Caroline Lamb. Lady Caroline Lamb didn't just cause trouble, she redefined it. Born into Anglo-Irish nobility and married into the heart of Britain's political elite, she spent her short life spinning through society like a spark tossed into dry straw. She was clever, dramatic, volatile, and, most notably, completely uninterested in being predictable. And though she wasn't technically royal by blood, her marriage to William Lamb, later Viscount Melbourne, Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister, brought her into the very edges of royalty. She had the connections, the titles, the invitations. And she had a knack for lighting fires in every room she entered. The phrase most often attached to her is the one she coined herself: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Though famously used to describe Lord Byron, her most infamous lover, it fits her just as well. Caroline came from the Ponsonby and Spencer families, both tied tightly into the political fabric of Britain. She was raised in privilege, surrounded by tutors and expectations, fluent in multiple languages, and known for her early brilliance. By the time she married William Lamb in 1805, she was already attracting attention for being more than a decorative bride. She was intelligent, outspoken, and increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, society tolerated her eccentricities. She dressed in costumes at balls, wrote satire, and hosted literary salons. But then came Byron, and everything changed. They met in 1812. Caroline was 26. Byron, the rising star of British poetry, was 24 and already building his reputation as a romantic destroyer. Their connection was instantaneous, electric, theatrical, and catastrophic. She pursued him with a ferocity that startled even her friends. He, for his part, seemed equally drawn and repelled. Their affair was passionate and public, with letters flying between them in code and Caroline writing his name in her diaries like a schoolgirl. But Byron was a man of appetites and attention spans. He grew bored quickly, and Caroline did not take boredom well. When he broke things off, she unraveled, spectacularly. She sent him messages hidden inside books. She carved his name into her skin, an act that was reported with the kind of Victorian horror that ensured no one would ever forget it. She dressed as a page boy and attempted to sneak into his house. she published a novel, Glenarvan, thinly veiled fiction where Byron appeared as a villainous seducer and she as the tragic heroine, wronged by a cruel and shallow world. It was a literary revenge piece that thrilled the public and horrified her social circle. The book's success did nothing to save her from the fallout. Her behavior was declared erratic. Her marriage suffered. Her family intervened. She was, unofficially, exiled from the polite society she once dazzled. And yet, Byron was only the most infamous name in a longer list. Caroline's emotional life was a revolving door of rumors and near certainties. She was linked to other poets, to artists, to members of her husband's political circle. Some of these relationships were likely platonic, intensified by her theatrical personality. Others, probably not. She was drawn to passion like a moth to an expensive candelabra. When she wasn't chasing it, she was writing about it, in letters, in poetry, in the margins of borrowed books. Her husband, William Lamb, was unusually tolerant. He remained married to her through the worst of it, even when she embarrassed him publicly. Whether out of affection or strategic patience, he endured what others would have fled. But the emotional toll showed. Caroline's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began taking laudanum. Her writing turned darker. Her friends became fewer. Still, she persisted. She continued writing, even as publishers hesitated. She appeared at events, even when she wasn't welcome. She lived loudly, unrepentantly, even as society closed its doors behind her. She died in 1828 at the age of 42, young, misunderstood, and already half forgotten by the world that once devoured her scandals. Her final years were marked by illness and retreat, but she never entirely disappeared from memory. Historians still debate how much of her story was exaggerated, how much invented, and how much was simply too wild to be allowed into official record. Lady Caroline Lamb's legacy is that of a woman who broke the rules before society had the language to explain what she was doing. She loved recklessly, fought publicly, and blurred the line between artist and subject. She wasn't royalty, but she walked among them and rattled their portraits on the walls. And if Caroline lambasted the hypocrisy of the elite with fire and scandal, Nell Gwyn would turn that fire into applause. Because the next royal companion didn't just have lovers, she had an audience. A king's mistress who rose from the stage to the palace, Nell Gwyn wasn't born noble, but she became legendary, and her list of admirers was almost as long as her list of punchlines. 17. Nell Gwyn, Eleanor. Nell Gwyn began life in a world that didn't usually allow second chances, let alone stardom. Born into poverty in 1650, possibly in a brothel and almost certainly in the shadow of London's darker corners, Nell was not supposed to end up anywhere near a palace. She wasn't born royal. She wasn't noble. She wasn't even particularly well educated. What she was, however, was quick, observant, fearless, and devastatingly funny. And in the post-Puritan England of Charles II, that was enough. Nell entered the theater world in her teens, likely selling oranges to patrons at the King's Theatre in London. The orange girl job, ostensibly just fruit sales, was one of the few ways poor women could legally enter the theater world and, by extension, the edges of high society. It was a position heavy with implication, and Nell was quick to see its potential. Within a few months, she was on stage herself, acting in comedies and capturing attention with a voice that sliced through every corner of the room. She had no formal training. What she had was timing. Nell made her mark in Restoration comedies, where wit was a weapon and beauty was expected to come with a punchline. Audiences loved her. So did the actors. And so did a particular group of men with the wealth and freedom to pursue anything or anyone that amused them. It didn't take long before her name was linked with Charles Hart, a prominent actor, and then with the Earl of Dorset. But those were only preludes. Because eventually, Nell Gwyn met Charles II. The king, already known for his expansive interest in women and his habit of making mistresses into minor celebrities found in Nell something his court didn't usually provide: entertainment with no strings attached. She was lively, irreverent, and, most refreshingly, unpretentious. She made him laugh. She also refused to flatter him the way other women did. She spoke plainly, even teasingly, and somehow this only deepened his affection. They began an affair that would last for years. Nell gave birth to 2 of his children, though only one survived: Charles Beauclerk, whom the king later ennobled as the Duke of St. Albans. She was given a house in Pall Mall, an allowance, and the semi-official role of royal mistress. But what set Nell apart from her rivals wasn't access. It was how she used it. Unlike many royal mistresses, Nell never aspired to court manipulation. She didn't involve herself in politics. She didn't lobby for titles or land, at least not aggressively. She stayed away from the vicious competition among other royal favorites, including the notorious Barbara Villiers and Louise de Keroualle, both of whom had the aristocratic pedigree Nell lacked. Instead, Nell played the long game of charm. She attended court events but never pretended to belong. She was, in a way, the people's mistress, mocked by some, beloved by many. There's an apocryphal story about a mob mistaking her carriage for that of the Catholic Louise de Keroualle. When they began throwing insults and threatening violence, Nell stuck her head out the window and shouted, "Pray, good people, I am the Protestant whore!" The crowd reportedly erupted in laughter and let her pass. That was Nell's magic. She disarmed criticism with humor and held on to power not by force or scheming, but by being impossible to dislike. Still, the king's affection couldn't shield her from every hardship. She worried constantly about money, particularly after Charles's death in 1685. The new king, James II, had no interest in continuing his brother's arrangements. Nell wrote to him, pleading for her son's inheritance. It worked, just barely. Beauclerk kept his title, and Nell received a modest pension. But the security of her golden years depended less on royal grace and more on her own reputation. Nell died young, at 37, from what was probably complications related to stroke. She left behind debts, a modest estate, and a legend that stretched far beyond the walls of any theater or palace. For decades after her death, pamphlets and plays invoked her name as shorthand for wit, sensuality, and resilience. Unlike other royal mistresses who vanished into political footnotes, Nell became a character in England's national imagination, half myth, half cautionary tale, and all charisma. What makes her story linger isn't just her rise from poverty or her role as a royal companion. It's that she remained herself, always. She never apologized for her origins, never cloaked her humor in lace, never pretended to be a duchess when she was better at being Nell. And if Nell Gwyn charmed a king with laughter, then the next royal woman, Princess Sophia, daughter of George III, would find herself tangled in far more troubling rumors. Because unlike Nell, Sophia didn't seek scandal. But scandal, fueled by whispers of secret pregnancies and illicit affairs, found her anyway, and left a trail the palace could never quite scrub clean. 18. Princess Sophia, daughter of George III. In the shadows of the grand, sprawling dysfunction that was the Hanoverian royal family, Princess Sophia remains one of the quietest and most unsettling mysteries. She was the 12th child and 5th daughter of King George III and Queen Charlotte, born in 1777 into a palace that had perfected the art of controlled appearances. Unlike her more famous siblings, like the future King George IV, who managed to scandalize the entire continent, Sophia's reputation was, for a long time, almost aggressively unremarkable, demure, dutiful, quiet. And yet, it is precisely that silence that has allowed one of the most persistent and strange rumors in British royal history to flourish: that Princess Sophia had an illegitimate child. And not just any child, but one fathered by a royal servant, a man of lower rank, questionable power, and very little social permission to even be in the same sentence as a princess. A man named Thomas Garth. To understand the depth of this rumor, and why it never quite went away, you have to understand the stranglehold Queen Charlotte had on her daughters. She ruled their lives like an overzealous governess with a copy of the conduct of the female sex permanently clutched in her hands. The princesses were discouraged from marrying, prevented from socializing freely, and lived lives so intensely controlled that some likened their existence to emotional imprisonment. While the sons were out accruing mistresses, debts, and illegitimate children by the dozen, the daughters embroidered handkerchiefs and aged quietly behind palace gates. Sophia, by all accounts, longed for something else, and that longing may have manifested in the form of Colonel Thomas Garth, a royal equerry, respectable, older, and far enough outside the acceptable sphere of suitors that his name alone was enough to stir a scandal. The relationship was never formally acknowledged, but around 1800 Sophia, then in her early 20s, allegedly gave birth in secret. Here is where the facts and the rumors begin their long, uncomfortable dance. In 1800, a boy named Thomas Garth, yes, with the same name as the colonel, was born and raised by Colonel Garth as his own son. The official line was that the child was his illegitimate son by an unnamed woman. The colonel claimed paternity. He provided for the boy. He kept things quiet, but gossip spread almost immediately that the child was, in fact, Princess Sophia's, and that Colonel Garth was not covering his own shame, but hers. Palace officials naturally denied it. They had to. An unmarried royal daughter giving birth out of wedlock would have been explosive, especially during the reign of George III, whose descent into mental illness had already thrown the monarchy into chaos. So instead, Sophia was quietly withdrawn from public view. She appeared less frequently at court. She became ill, according to records, plagued by nervous disorders. The kind that, in Victorian code, often referred to something emotional, scandalous, or both. Despite the denials, the story refused to die. Even decades later, society gossiped about the boy's resemblance to the royal family, his generous education, and the pension he received. Courtesy, some said, of the crown. Princess Sophia never married, never confirmed or denied the rumor, and kept a kind of dignified silence that left just enough space for speculation to breed. Some historians have tried to debunk the entire thing, pointing out that the evidence is circumstantial and that no contemporary diary directly confirms the pregnancy. Others argue that the very absence of formal record is suspicious, that erasure, not transparency, was the palace's go-to method for handling uncomfortable truths. And then there's the theory that it wasn't Garth at all, that Sophia's child, if he existed, was the product of something darker, an abuse of power by a family member. That theory is even more speculative, even more uncomfortable, and even harder to disprove. Most scholars tiptoe around it for good reason. It's impossible to prove, and its implications are devastating. Regardless of the truth, Sophia lived the rest of her life in a peculiar form of stasis. Neither disgraced nor celebrated, she participated in court life, wrote letters full of melancholy, and showed flashes of wit that suggested a woman who had once hoped for more than dutiful invisibility. She died in 1848, aged 71, surrounded by royal formality, but with very few personal attachments. No husband, no publicly acknowledged children, only a life shaped by the confines of reputation and the slow erosion of potential. Whether she bore a child or not, whether she loved Thomas Garth or merely leaned on him emotionally, Princess Sophia's story is a reminder that scandal doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it's quiet, hidden in plain sight, written in the margins of polite history, preserved in the lives of people no one's supposed to ask about. And if Sophia's scandal was shrouded in denial, then Queen Mary II, the next woman on our journey, was wrapped in something far more dangerous: statecraft, court politics, and the whispered suggestion that even the most devoutly Protestant queens weren't immune to the temptations of well-placed men. 19. Queen Mary II. Of all the English queens who walked the tightrope between image and reality, Queen Mary II remains one of the most paradoxical. On paper, she was the ideal Protestant monarch, dignified, pious, loyal to her husband, and politically essential to the glorious revolution. She ruled not as a wife hiding behind her husband's authority, but as a co-sovereign beside William III, an arrangement as rare as it was delicate. Her reign was marked by a carefully constructed narrative of moral integrity, Protestant virtue, and unwavering support for constitutional monarchy. And yet, for a woman remembered as almost aggressively virtuous, the shadows around Mary were never entirely empty. Long before she was queen, before William, before the Revolution, Mary was a teenage girl growing up in a court full of sharp glances, arranged futures, and more than a few whispered names. And some of those names, according to rumor, were not purely platonic. Mary was born in 1662, the daughter of James, Duke of York, later James II, and Anne Hyde. Her early life was shaped by contradictions. Her father converted to Catholicism in a country that still nursed wounds from the Civil War and Cromwell's Puritan rule. Her mother, a strong-willed commoner elevated to duchess, gave Mary her stubbornness and perhaps her sharp sense of judgment. She was raised Anglican, devoutly so, in what would soon become a deeply divided royal household. At the age of 15, Mary was married off to her first cousin, William of Orange, the Protestant ruler of the Netherlands. It was a political alliance, carefully arranged to strengthen ties between England and the Dutch Republic and to counterbalance Mary's increasingly Catholic father. Mary cried for days after the engagement was announced. She barely knew William. She hadn't chosen him. Her heart, according to more than one court source, had already been occupied, though no one dared say quite by whom. Rumors from her early court life suggest a series of flirtations, or possibly more, with men in her father's circle and her own. There were whispers about her fondness for certain gentlemen of the household, some of whom were abruptly reassigned or quietly retired. One such figure was a young gentleman-in-waiting whose name never quite made it into official records but appears, just once, in a letter from a lady-in-waiting described only as a young man of bold expression and too much familiarity. Of course, in the carefully censored world of royal correspondence, that line might be as close as one could get to saying something happened. Or it might have been nothing. The line between intense teenage emotion and actual impropriety is often blurred, especially when the person in question is destined for a throne. Regardless of any youthful attachments, Mary accepted her fate and married William. She moved to the Netherlands and embraced her role with a combination of grace and resignation. William, more serious and politically focused than romantic, rarely offered warmth. He was often away on campaign. Mary, left in The Hague, corresponded with her English friends and family, some of whom noted her increasing loneliness. It was during these lonely years that a different set of rumors emerged, this time centered not on Mary's past, but on her role in court diplomacy. She was known to cultivate close relationships with certain male courtiers, who acted as intermediaries between her and her husband. Some were Dutch nobles, others were English agents. A few remained unusually close. Their letters to her were formal, but sometimes too long, sometimes too personal. Was this simply politics, conducted through the familiar language of aristocratic friendship? Probably. But the court never missed a chance to speculate. Even her own sister Anne would later imply that Mary had not always been as emotionally restrained as she pretended. The two sisters eventually fell out, publicly, bitterly, and Anne, known for her own network of confidants and implied emotional entanglements, never hesitated to imply that Mary's public virtue had, at times, been a little too carefully curated. When Mary and William jointly assumed the English throne after the Glorious Revolution, the public narrative of her life was rewritten. She was now the Protestant heroine who had helped save England from the tyranny of Catholic absolutism. Her image was that of the loyal wife, the model queen, the religious reformer, Whatever rumors had trailed her before were promptly swept aside, and yet, those rumors have lingered in footnotes and side comments ever since. Not because they were particularly scandalous, but because they suggest something more subtle, that Mary, for all her public restraint, had been a young woman once. A woman with feelings, and perhaps regrets. A woman whose path to the throne had not been as straightforward as the portraits implied. She died young, at the age of 32, mourned across England for her dignity, her grace, and her unwavering commitment to her role. William, who had never been particularly expressive, was devastated. But in the quiet corners of history, the question remains. What might Mary have been if she'd been allowed to choose? And if Mary's rumored romances were softened by time and theology, the next royal, Princess Charlotte of Wales, burned with intensity in her own brief life. Passionate, idealistic, and pulled between duty and desire, Charlotte would leave behind a trail of broken engagements, forbidden letters, and the echoes of a future queen who never got the chance to rule, or to love freely. 20. Princess Charlotte of Wales. Princess Charlotte of Wales was born into expectation, and not the gentle kind. She was, quite literally, the future of the monarchy. A single flickering flame in a family line riddled with scandal, illegitimacy, and the looming threat of extinction. As the only legitimate child of George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, and Caroline of Brunswick, Charlotte carried the heavy burden of being the only royal offspring the public actually liked. But behind the royal pageantry and the carefully staged portraits was a young woman of strong opinions, complicated affections, and a restlessness that would defy almost every attempt to manage her. Her life was short, just 21 years, but even in those few years she accumulated more rumored lovers, emotional entanglements, and thwarted romances than some monarchs managed in entire reigns. Her parents' marriage was a disaster from the moment they met. George famously disliked Caroline on sight and took up with his longtime mistress the day after the wedding. Charlotte, caught in the crossfire, was raised in a court torn by bitterness and showmanship. Her father used her as leverage. Her mother used her as a shield. And the result was a girl raised in isolation, but with a keen sense of how emotion could be both weapon and refuge. By her teenage years, Charlotte had become a public figure, a symbol of hope for a country tired of her father's indulgences and her uncle's long parade of mistresses. She was intelligent, fiery, and dangerously empathetic. The public adored her. The palace? Less so. At court, her romantic life was treated as a matter of state. Suitors were proposed, examined, and rejected like foreign policies. One of the earliest, and most persistent, was Prince William of Orange, a politically convenient match with the strategic benefit of reinforcing alliances with the Dutch. Charlotte, however, was unimpressed. She found him cold, overly serious, and, most damningly, he reminded her of her father. She agreed to the match under duress, only to later renege in a public, defiant refusal that scandalized the court and thrilled the press. But while the official records focus on Prince William, the real drama of Charlotte's love life lived in the shadows of her friendships and private letters. She formed close, and in some cases intensely emotional, bonds with several men who hovered at the edges of acceptability. One of these was Captain Charles Hesse, a dashing cavalry officer rumored to have shared a secret correspondence with the princess. Their relationship was never formally acknowledged, but eyewitnesses described long, lingering conversations, gifts exchanged in secrecy, and a few intercepted letters that were quickly hushed up by palace officials. When Charlotte was confronted about the connection, she reportedly burst into tears and refused to speak for days. Then there was Lieutenant General Robert Wilson, another soldier whose proximity to Charlotte raised royal eyebrows. She praised him in letters. She requested his attendance at private events. His name was conspicuously absent from official court bulletins, which, in royal terms, often means it was repeated in every drawing room. To call these affairs romantic might be overstating them, though perhaps not. What is certain is that Charlotte, confined within the silken cage of royal duty, reached out emotionally to the few men who seemed to treat her like a person rather than a political symbol. Whether or not they loved her back, or even fully understood her position, is less clear. What is clear is that Charlotte's emotional world was as intense as it was policed. Eventually, her path collided with Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a minor German royal with charm, composure, and a surprising gift for sincerity. He was not her first choice, nor was she his, at least initially, but their relationship blossomed into something rare for royalty, genuine affection. They married in 1816, and for the first time in her life, Charlotte seemed to have found a balance between duty and desire. It did not last. Less than a year after the wedding, Charlotte died in childbirth, along with her stillborn son. The nation mourned her as if she had already been queen. Thousands gathered in silence. Shops closed. The stock market dipped. The country had not merely lost a princess, it had lost its next chapter. In death, Charlotte became a national tragedy. In life, she had been a contradiction, publicly adored, privately constrained, emotionally vivid in a world built on emotional denial. Her rumored lovers and broken engagements were not just scandals. They were symptoms of a system that demanded loyalty while offering no outlet for longing. Had she lived, she would have been queen. And perhaps more dangerously, a queen who remembered what it felt like to love without permission. And while Charlotte's life ended in aching potential, the next royal figure, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was the architect of a different kind of scandal. One that existed in court whispers, ambiguous alliances, and a relationship with a royal advisor so fraught with power, emotion, and rumor that the line between political partnership and personal intimacy became nearly impossible to define. 21. Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Before there was Queen Victoria, the icon in black, the empress of half the world, there was Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, her mother. A widowed German duchess turned English royal matriarch, she stood at the edge of power, neither fully in it nor ever far from it. Her story is often reduced to a footnote in her daughter's legend, overshadowed by the great monarch she raised. But behind the nursery doors and royal protocols lived a woman whose private life fueled decades of palace whispers, all circling around one man, Sir John Conroy. Officially, Conroy was her advisor, her controller, her private secretary. Unofficially, depending on who you asked, he was her confidant, her emotional support, her co-conspirator, and possibly much more. Victoria of Saxe-Coburg was born in 1786 into a minor German royal house and married Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of George III. The match was strategic. Edward needed an heir, and she needed a future. The union produced one child, the future queen. But Prince Edward died less than a year later, leaving his wife stranded in England, a German-speaking widow with an infant daughter and little financial independence. And this is where Sir John Conroy enters the scene. Conroy was ambitious, intelligent, and upwardly mobile, the kind of man who understood that power in royal circles often flowed not from titles, but from proximity. He attached himself to the Duchess early and thoroughly. As her controller, he ran her finances, her household, her schedule, and, over time, her image. He styled himself as her protector, her advisor, her indispensable ally in the hostile waters of the British court. But the nature of his closeness with the Duchess raised eyebrows almost immediately. They spent an extraordinary amount of time together, alone and unchaperoned. He accompanied her everywhere, to the theater, to social visits, to royal functions. His influence over her was so complete that foreign ambassadors began referring to them as a pair. Rumors swirled that he held too much sway, not just over her decisions, but over her heart, and perhaps her body as well. Officially, there was no affair. There were no love letters, no confessions, no declarations. And yet few within the court believed their relationship was entirely platonic. The sheer degree of access Conroy enjoyed was itself scandalous. For a man with no noble blood and no legitimate claim to royal favor, he moved through the Duchess's life with the confidence of someone whose position could not be threatened, not by protocol nor by public perception. Those who knew them best noted the emotional undertones that seemed to bleed through the official narrative. He called her dearest friend. She defended him fiercely against critics. When Queen Victoria later took the throne, she would remember how often her mother had leaned on Conroy's voice and let it become the law of the household. But the rumors didn't stop with them. The most explosive suggestion, never proven but never quite forgotten, was that Conroy aspired to marry the young Princess Victoria off to his own son, ensuring permanent access to the royal bloodline. Others whispered that he wanted the Duchess herself, and that theirs had been a long, private relationship masquerading as loyalty. Whatever the truth, their bond shaped the future queen's childhood, and not for the better. The Kensington system, the strict regimen developed by the Duchess and Conroy to control the young Victoria's upbringing, was as much psychological straitjacket as educational plan. The future queen was isolated, micromanaged, denied friends, and kept constantly supervised. The goal was clear: to make her emotionally dependent on her mother, and, by extension, on Conroy. It didn't work. When Victoria ascended the throne at 18, one of her first acts was to dismiss Conroy, publicly, firmly. She never forgave him, nor her mother, for the restrictions of her childhood. The Duchess, once the most powerful woman in Victoria's life, was reduced to a peripheral presence at court. She lived out her years in quiet dignity, but the air around her never lost the trace of scandal. Modern historians remain divided. Some argue that the rumors were exaggerated, products of a misogynistic court unable to accept that a widow might trust a male advisor without falling into his bed. Others believe the absence of hard proof is the result of deliberate erasure. After all, both the Duchess and Conroy had every incentive to keep their reputations intact. And few things were cleaned up faster in royal circles than inconvenient passion. Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld died in 1861, just 8 months before her daughter's beloved husband, Prince Albert. Her passing was marked respectfully, though not with deep mourning. She had, after all, served her purpose. She had delivered a monarch, and the crown had moved on. But her legacy remains shadowed by the man who stood so closely beside her for so many years. Was Conroy merely her servant, or something far more intimate? An emotional partner the history books politely refuse to name? Whatever the truth, the palace never quite stopped watching what she did, and who she did it with. And if Victoria's mother navigated scandal behind closed doors, the next queen, the beloved Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had her own trail of polite rumors, always smiling, always dignified, always perfectly powdered. And yet, even she had her name quietly attached to a few of the most unexpected gentlemen in Britain's upper crust. 22. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The public knew her as the smiling symbol of British endurance, a widow in pearls, waving through air raids, stepping out of rubble with perfectly pinned hats and immaculate calm. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, became an icon of 20th century resilience, the elegant matriarch who helped steady the monarchy through abdication, war, and personal loss. But behind that polished exterior, beneath the soft focus photographs and maternal charm, lay a more complicated woman, a royal figure of razor-sharp calculation, deep sentiment, and, if certain long-standing rumors are to be believed, a personal life that was not as neatly monogamous as it appeared. Born Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1900, she came from Scottish nobility, not royal but close enough to know how the system worked. When she married Prince Albert, Duke of York, later George VI, she stepped reluctantly into the firm. It was a practical match on paper, but the bond between them was real. She grounded him, soothed his insecurities, and offered a kind of emotional ballast the shy, stammering prince desperately needed. And yet, the fairy tale image of a devoted royal couple, sealed in amber, has never quite silenced the quiet murmurs that she may have had attachments elsewhere, relationships that danced just out of reach of scandal, but never entirely out of earshot. The rumors span decades, and they carry with them a distinct flavor. Not scandalous enough to shatter reputations, but persistent enough to leave footprints. They never erupted. They echoed, especially where David Niven was concerned. Niven, the impossibly charming actor and British cultural darling, was long rumored to have shared a special closeness with the Queen Mother. They moved in overlapping circles, social, aristocratic, and cinematic, and were photographed together often. He was everything a wartime king could never be: relaxed, dashing, funny, and gloriously non-royal. He represented glamour in a way Elizabeth could admire at a safe distance, and perhaps not always so safe. He was also married, and so was she. The idea that their friendship tipped into something more was never officially suggested by the palace, of course. But Niven's own memoirs were coy. He referred to an unnamed royal confidant with affection and admiration, someone who had, in his words, a sharper wit than anyone expected. The public mostly shrugged. After all, Elizabeth was above reproach, or at least that was the agreement. But she was also discreetly surrounded by other men of note: poets, politicians, military figures, old friends of the family who, for decades, were always present, but rarely named. One of the most intriguing names? Group Captain Peter Townsend. Yes, the same Peter Townsend who famously fell in love with her daughter, Princess Margaret, and caused one of the most public romantic crises in royal history. Before he ever pursued Margaret, Townsend had already earned the trust of the royal family during World War II as an equerry and close companion of George VI. And, according to certain archival whispers, he also developed a quiet, possibly romantic rapport with the Queen Mother. Historians argue over the timeline. Did the Queen Mother encourage Townsend's closeness to Margaret out of affection? Did she already know him more intimately than records suggest? There's no evidence, only the curious emotional entanglement between all three. A triangle of loyalty, grief, and unsaid things. And that, perhaps, is the most telling part of Queen Elizabeth's rumored romances. They were always shrouded in emotional ambiguity. She lived through a war. She lost a husband early. She watched her daughter take on the heaviest crown in the world. And through it all, she maintained a public persona so expertly curated that even decades of close attention have yet to produce anything resembling scandal. Only suggestion. She was also a master of charm, deploying it strategically, but always with a light touch. Aristocrats and actors alike found her magnetic. Anecdotes from courtiers often describe her laughter, her glances, the way she held a hand a beat too long. Was it just charisma, or the sign of someone who knew exactly how much she could get away with? Even in her later years, the Queen Mother maintained her network of admirers. She hosted lunches filled with aging generals, diplomats, and actors, many of whom had known her since the 1930s, and many of whom still spoke of her not as a grandmotherly fixture of royal tradition, but as someone who had once turned heads, and maybe, once or twice, hearts. She lived to be over 100, outlasting nearly everyone who might have offered clarification. Her diaries were private, her letters carefully protected. What she left behind was a legacy of warmth, but also control. She understood better than most that mystery is the most lasting form of influence. And so, the Queen Mother remains an enigma, loved by the public, respected by the palace, and perhaps quietly adored by more than one man who never made it into the history books as anything more than a close friend. But if her secrets were carefully maintained, the next royal on our journey, Princess Alexandra of Kent, belonged to a generation where public discretion and private affection no longer danced so far apart. Her quiet charm masked a surprisingly lively social life, and among those circles, the question was often the same: who was just a friend, and who wasn't? 23. Princess Alexandra of Kent. Princess Alexandra of Kent is not a name that typically makes headlines. She was never expected to ascend the throne, never embroiled in constitutional crises, never the face of a monarchy under siege. And yet, within royal circles, she was known as something far more intriguing. A woman who moved quietly through the glittering world of 20th century aristocracy with poise, beauty, and the kind of whispered charm that drew attention without ever inviting scandal, at least not officially. Born in 1936, Princess Alexandra was the daughter of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. She was a cousin to Queen Elizabeth II, a first-tier member of the royal family, and from a young age carried herself with the confident elegance that defined mid-century royalty. Tall, graceful, and effortlessly photogenic, she was frequently compared to fashion icons and often described in the press as striking or regal with flair. But behind the polished exterior and perfectly choreographed appearances was a woman whose private relationships sparked quiet speculation for decades. Unlike many other royals, Alexandra was known for having close male friendships that seemed to defy easy categorization. In public, she adhered to protocol with textbook precision, smiling just enough, attending just often enough, and avoiding any overt controversy. But in private, she surrounded herself with a trusted circle of socialites, artists, aristocrats, and diplomats, many of whom were men. And several of those relationships, though never publicly acknowledged as romantic, were close enough to raise the same question over and over again. Just how close? One of the earliest names linked to her was Angus Ogilvy, a businessman and member of the aristocracy, whom she eventually married in 1963. Their union was portrayed as a love match, and for all public purposes, it was. Angus was polished, understated, and loyal, and Alexandra seemed genuinely attached to him. But even within the royal family, their marriage was considered open to interpretation. Before their marriage, and for many years after, Alexandra was rumored to maintain emotionally significant friendships with other men. Some of these men were part of the extended royal household. Others were European nobles, and a few, less predictably, came from the art and theater world. She was known to attend private parties, charity events, and gallery openings where she was often seen in the company of men who were decidedly not her husband. It wasn't that anyone accused her of impropriety, no tabloid exposés, no scandals splashed across Sunday headlines. Just that subtle shift in tone, the pause in conversation, the glance exchanged between guests when she entered the room with someone unexpected. There were whispers about a particular Italian diplomat, a man who attended several of her private charity engagements and was known to write her long, handwritten letters in ornate calligraphy. Their friendship was described as intellectually intense and frequent in correspondence. A phrase that, in palace language, might mean anything from genuine platonic affection to something far less public. Then there was the British photographer whose name circulated briefly among royal insiders in the 1970s. He was reportedly invited to several private family events, had an uncanny access to Alexandra's schedule, and was seen leaving her London residence on more than one occasion. No statements were made. No official inquiries were launched. But the stories persisted. And in a family where discretion is often a more valuable currency than truth, that was all it took to keep a rumor alive. What made Alexandra especially enigmatic was her ability to float above the chatter. She never courted the press the way Princess Margaret did. She never triggered constitutional alarms like Diana or Meghan. She remained within the bounds of decorum, but always just near enough to its edges to keep people guessing. Even her marriage, though publicly harmonious, was marked by periods of physical and social distance. Ogilvy traveled extensively for business, and Alexandra often attended events solo. They maintained separate lives in many respects, and while there was no hint of animosity, there was also little of the visible closeness expected of high-profile royal couples. And yet, she retained her public image flawlessly. She served as a working royal for decades, representing the crown with tireless dedication. She opened hospitals, led charities, and maintained a reputation for elegance and humility. But her personal life, who she truly loved, who she might have loved in secret, remained her own. Today, Princess Alexandra stands as one of the few remaining links to the older pre-Diana era of the royal family, an era of practiced discretion, formal smiles, and emotional opacity. Her life invites more curiosity than controversy, more respectful speculation than scandal. But it also leaves a lingering question in its wake. Behind the carefully measured charm, was there a woman who gave more of her heart away than history is ever likely to admit? And if Alexandra's quiet mystery was built on restraint and soft defiance, the next royal, Princess Louise of Great Britain, daughter of George II, belonged to an era when even modest deviations from royal decorum could ignite whispers across continents. With musicians, officers, and maybe even more than one private tutor in the picture, Louise's reputation was far less reserved and far more rumored. 24. Princess Louise of Great Britain, daughter of George II. If the Hanoverian dynasty was an orchestra of dysfunction, then Princess Louise of Great Britain was the faint but persistent flute note that kept slipping off key. Born in 1724, the youngest surviving daughter of King George II and Queen Caroline, Louise grew up under a regime that valued duty over desire, alliances over affection. Yet, like so many royals of her age, she was never content to simply be a name on a marriage contract. Her life, though far less famous than those of her siblings, left behind just enough trace evidence to fuel centuries of soft-spoken intrigue. Louise's childhood was, in many ways, a study in contradiction. Her father, George II, was famously irascible, emotionally distant, and fiercely protective of his authority. Her mother, Caroline of Ansbach, was far more intellectually inclined, favoring philosophy and science over court gossip. This didn't make her less politically shrewd, just better at hiding it. Louise, watching her mother maneuver from behind the throne, learned early on that being underestimated was its own form of freedom. She was never expected to rule. That gave her a strange kind of power, the power of the royal spare. You're too valuable to ignore, but not so essential that every step you take must be choreographed to national expectations. And Louise made use of that leeway, especially in the relationships she formed before her marriage. Though formal records remain vague, court gossip pointed regularly toward Louise's uncommonly close relationships with several members of the royal household. One persistent name was a German musician, employed to entertain the court and tutor Louise in composition and performance. Sources described him as frequent in her chambers and notably familiar, which, in 18th century code, was a polite way of saying everyone noticed how often they were alone. Louise's musical talents were frequently praised, and so were the long hours she spent rehearsing. But what began as artistic mentorship appears, at least to the court observers of the time, to have leaned into emotional territory. When the musician was suddenly reassigned to another post abroad with a generous pension and no clear explanation, the court interpreted it less as a reward and more as a royal extraction. And he wasn't the only man whose closeness to Louise raised eyebrows. There were also the officers. Particularly one captain in the household guard, who was described as having been in the princess's favor for longer than protocol usually allowed. His attendance at court events was unremarkable. His presence at smaller, more private family gatherings was not. He eventually resigned from his commission for health reasons and was granted a minor estate. Again, polite language doing the heavy lifting. But all these premarital rumors were eventually buried beneath the grandeur of her marriage. In 1743, at the age of 19, Louise married Frederick V of Denmark and Norway. It was a dynastic alliance meant to strengthen Protestant ties across Northern Europe and export one spare daughter of Britain into the cold machinery of Scandinavian statecraft. The Danish court received her with the expected pomp. She was crowned Queen of Denmark and Norway within a year, and gave birth to multiple children, including the future King Christian VII. And yet, her new life was hardly romantic. Frederick, while handsome and charming in public, was notoriously unstable in private. His drinking, womanizing, and erratic behavior made him more of a court liability than a partner. And as queen consort, Louise found herself once again isolated, this time in a foreign country where her English roots were viewed with suspicion and her influence limited by custom. But isolation has a way of creating its own kind of rebellion. Though Louise maintained her duties with discipline, she also cultivated relationships with several Danish courtiers and artists. She sponsored musicians and architects, many of whom became regulars at her private salons. At least one painter was rumored to have received unusual access to the royal apartments. And while these relationships never erupted into public scandal, Danish courtiers made their opinions known through the usual weapon of choice: ambiguous memoirs, laden with metaphor and innuendo. Louise died young, at just 27 years old, officially of complications related to childbirth. Her death sparked genuine mourning in Denmark and Britain alike. She had, after all, played her part, produced heirs, smiled in portraits, honored the terms of her diplomatic transaction. But the private notes she left behind, letters, journals, dedications, hint at a woman who felt both deeply and often. A woman who was never allowed to love freely, and so loved quietly instead. Was she the demure consort historians once painted her to be? Perhaps. Or perhaps she simply learned to veil her attachments in the language of patronage and music, gifting favors instead of kisses, attention instead of confession. Because in royal households affection isn't always written into the record, but it is almost always remembered. And if Louise's quiet, coded life hinted at hidden desire, Queen Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I, left behind legends of a different flavor entirely. Legends that spoke of youth before the crown, of whispered romances, and of a queen who may have brought more to court than just her piety. 25. Queen Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I. History prefers her draped in reverence. Queen Matilda of Scotland, the pious wife of King Henry I, daughter of Scottish royalty and Saxon saints, remembered more often for her charity and church building than for anything resembling scandal. She was nicknamed Good Queen Maud, a woman said to have preferred the company of monks over courtiers, a queen who washed the feet of beggars and sat with lepers, the ideal medieval consort, which is exactly why the whispers that followed her never entirely died. Born around 1080 as Edith of Scotland, Matilda was the daughter of King Malcolm III and Queen Margaret of Wessex. Her mother was canonized after her death, giving Matilda not only royal blood, but a sacred lineage. Her education was extensive, her courtly manners refined by years spent in abbeys among Benedictine nuns and religious scholars. She was intelligent, well-read, and known for her grace, even before the crown. And yet, that pre-marriage period, those strange, quiet years between adolescence and queenship, remains curiously foggy. The records are sparse, the testimonies contradictory, and the rumors surprisingly persistent for someone later painted as the medieval ideal. The most enduring speculation centers on her time spent at Wilton Abbey, where she was supposedly educated. According to some chroniclers, she was placed there as a child oblate, essentially dedicated to the religious life. Others insist it was merely for her safety during political turmoil in Scotland. Still others claim she never took formal vows at all. But then, there's the issue of her veil. When King Henry III sought to marry her in 1100, just days after his brother William Rufus was mysteriously killed in a hunting accident, Matilda's status was a matter of political urgency. A marriage to her would secure Henry's claim to the throne, link him to the ancient Anglo-Saxon line, and give him legitimacy in the eyes of both Norman barons and English commoners. But there was a problem. Some claimed Matilda had taken the veil, which would have made her a nun, and thus ineligible to marry. The debate raged not in backrooms, but in royal councils. Bishops were summoned. Witnesses brought forward. Matilda herself insisted she had never taken holy vows, only wore the veil for protection while living among nuns. Convenient, perhaps, but convincing enough. The marriage proceeded. But that strange legal wrangling over whether she had, at one point, belonged to the church, spiritually if not legally, hinted at a life more complicated than the sanitized version that came later. Questions about what really happened during those abbey years were never fully answered. And when combined with the scattered and rather pointed rumors about youthful affection and hidden lovers, a different picture begins to form. One medieval chronicler, who tellingly wrote anonymously, suggested that Matilda had been acquainted in youth with a man of learning, whom she did much favor. The details stop there. No name, no confession. Just an implication that some emotional, or perhaps more than emotional attachment, had existed before her time as queen. Another rumor placed her in the affections of a nobleman tied to her father's court in Scotland, someone who wrote poems to her in secret and was seen too often beneath the abbey's walls. Again, there's no hard evidence. But as usual with medieval queens, absence of evidence isn't quite the same as absence of intrigue. Once queen, Matilda played her public role to perfection. She was deeply involved in charity, patronized religious houses, and remained politically active on Henry's behalf. She acted as regent when he was away, signed official documents, and received envoys. But even in her queenship, she maintained correspondence with several figures from her past, including churchmen whose letters took on a surprisingly personal tone. Not improper, just warm, intimate in a way that suggested emotional depth. Perhaps the most interesting of these was her continued support of an unnamed clerk who later became a bishop. Some letters refer to him as her beloved in Christ, a phrase that could be purely spiritual or not. The line between religious endearment and romantic subtext was always thin in the 12th century, especially when both were wrapped in Latin. Matilda died in 1118 and was mourned sincerely. Her piety was emphasized in every eulogy. Chroniclers spoke of her healing hands, her prayers, her quiet wisdom. But the veil that began her story, the one she may or may not have taken in youth, never entirely left her image. Even centuries later, historians still debate whether she had ever truly been destined for the convent, or whether that part of her legend was just a convenient cover for a youthful mistake, or a youthful romance. If Matilda loved before Henry, it was erased carefully, turned into mist and marginalia. But the suggestion lingered, quietly upheld by just enough contradiction to feel deliberate. And from one royal woman whose path to marriage may have been delayed, or disguised, by youthful attachments, we turn to another whose romantic life unfolded boldly in the spotlight of European nobility. Princess Mary Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, didn't just marry for love. She defied a king, broke a diplomatic arrangement, and left behind a string of rumored suitors in her wake. 26. Princess Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. If there was ever a Tudor who understood how to turn a royal scandal into a personal victory, however temporary, it was Princess Mary Tudor, sister to King Henry VIII. Born into one of the most calculating and brutal dynasties in English history, Mary somehow emerged with her own peculiar brand of autonomy, a blend of charm, boldness, and audacity that allowed her to defy her brother, break a crown-sanctioned marriage, and carry on her life with a love story that sounded suspiciously like a court drama with a romantic rewrite. But before she became the poster girl for royal rebellion, Mary was just another noble daughter of Henry VII, raised with the burden of bloodlines, surrounded by courtiers, and educated in all the things a princess was supposed to know: languages, embroidery, and how to endure marriage as a political act. She was, by all accounts, exceptionally beautiful. Contemporary observers described her as golden-haired, luminous-skinned, and possessed of a natural elegance that set her apart even in a family not known for subtlety. Her charm wasn't just physical, though. It was personal. She was witty, quick, and could navigate the dangerous waters of Tudor court politics with more grace than many of her male relatives. Which is saying something, given that she grew up in a household where smiling at the wrong ambassador could accidentally launch a war. Her early life was scripted with familiar royal ink. In 1514, at the age of 18, she was married off to King Louis XII of France, a man more than 30 years her senior, in failing health, and desperately hoping for a young, fertile wife to produce a French heir before he expired. The match was political, of course. England needed the alliance. France needed legitimacy. And Mary, like all royal women of her time, was expected to comply without protest. But protest she did. Not overtly. There are no letters of refusal, no public disobedience, but she made her feelings perfectly clear in quieter ways. According to court records, she agreed to the match only after securing a promise from her brother. Once Louis died, she would be free to choose her next husband, and she already had someone in mind. Enter Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. He wasn't just any nobleman, he was Henry VIII's best friend, a former jousting champion with a reputation for charm, military skill, and depending on who you asked, a touch too much ambition. Mary and Charles had long shared a flirtation, perhaps more. Letters hint at a growing closeness during her time in England, and though the exact nature of their relationship remains elusive, what followed suggests this wasn't simply a courtly crush. 3 months after marrying Louis, Mary found herself widowed. The French king died, unsurprisingly, before she could bear any children. And just like that, Mary was the most eligible and politically important widow in Europe. But instead of waiting for her brother to arrange another alliance, Mary acted. Charles Brandon was dispatched to France to escort her back home. He was supposed to be diplomatic, respectful, and very, very restrained. He was none of those things. Somewhere between Paris and Calais, the two were married in secret, without permission, without diplomatic clearance, without even the courtesy of pretending to wait. For a royal princess to marry without the king's approval was considered treasonous. For her to marry his best friend? That was personal. Henry VIII was furious. He reportedly considered execution. But then again, Charles Brandon was his closest companion, and Mary, his favorite sister. Instead of blood, Henry settled for gold. He fined the couple heavily and required a public apology, but ultimately allowed the marriage to stand. Mary returned to England as the Duchess of Suffolk, and for a brief moment, she lived something few royals ever managed, a love story of her own design. But court gossip doesn't vanish just because a marriage becomes legitimate. Throughout her years at Suffolk House, Mary was rumored to have remained socially adventurous. Her household was full of young nobles, poets, and musicians. She attended court events with a sparkle that didn't fade after marriage. Some whispered that her flirtations didn't either. One name that appears in multiple accounts is a minor nobleman who served briefly as her steward. Young, unmarried, and often seen in her private galleries. His appointment was short-lived. So was his political career. Other reports note her unusually generous patronage of certain courtiers, including gifts of land and titles given to men who had only recently joined her household. Was any of this more than generosity? Impossible to say. Tudor records are careful about such things. Careful and deeply biased. But what stands out is how Mary maintained her independence of spirit long after her rebellion was forgiven. She died in 1533 at the age of 37, not long before her brother's kingdom began unraveling in earnest. Her tombstone reads simply, "The French Queen," a nod to the title she wore briefly, but one that never quite fit. She was, in the end, something rarer, a Tudor who chose love over politics, and somehow lived to tell the tale. And if Mary Tudor turned political marriage into personal triumph, Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the next royal in our long unraveling thread, would pay a much higher price for her forbidden affections. A queen locked away, accused of betrayal, her heart caught between a Swedish count and a crown that never wanted her in the first place. 27. Princess Sophia. Dorothea of Celle, wife of George I. Some royal marriages are cold, some are strategic, and some are so bitterly mismatched that they leave behind not just broken hearts, but broken histories. Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the ill-fated wife of King George I of Great Britain, lived through one of those marriages, one that began as a dynastic deal and ended in exile, scandal, and whispered treason. Hers is a story of love letters intercepted, a vanished Swedish count, and a lifetime spent behind locked doors, all because she dared to love in the wrong direction. Born in 1666 to George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and Eleanor Desmier-Dolbreuse, Sophia Dorothea was already a social complication before she could walk. Her mother was of noble French blood but not of royal rank, making Sophia Dorothea's legitimacy a perpetual debate at the rigid German courts. That she was acknowledged and raised as a duchess did little to erase the sting of semi-royal status. Enough to be useful, never enough to be respected. When the time came to marry her off, her prospects were limited. Royal houses wanted pure dynastic pedigree, not ambiguity. So when her cousin George Louis, the future George I of Great Britain, entered the picture, the match was welcomed not with joy, but resignation. They were first cousins, both from the ever-ambitious House of Hanover. He needed her dowry. She needed a title. Nobody needed affection. Their 1682 wedding was described as gloomy, which is diplomatic code for neither party was happy to be there. George Louis was stiff, uncharming, and emotionally inaccessible. Sophia Dorothea, by contrast, was expressive, social, and, as her contemporaries frequently noted, stubbornly unwilling to be miserable in silence. Their personalities were like oil and water, only less friendly. Within a year, the marriage was cracking. Within 5, it was held together only by appearances and shared obligations. But public roles don't erase private longing. And into that space of silence and cold formal dinners stepped Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman, soldier of fortune, and, more importantly, someone who looked at Sophia Dorothea as if she were more than a marriage contract. They met through court circles, and their connection seemed instant. He was charismatic, dashing, the kind of figure who could casually read poetry and duel by breakfast. She was miserable, intelligent, and desperate for someone to understand her. What followed was a series of encounters that would become the stuff of legend and investigation. They exchanged letters, dozens, maybe hundreds. Some survived, most did not. But the few that have resurfaced describe a deeply emotional, possibly romantic, definitely dangerous relationship. They wrote in code. They referenced secret meetings. Some letters contained flourishes of language that, while not explicit, left little doubt as to their affection. Whether they crossed the threshold into physical intimacy is still debated by historians, but the emotional intensity alone was enough to fuel a scandal. Their correspondence did not stay secret for long. The court, always hungry for gossip and quick to protect the crown, grew suspicious. Interceptions were made. Spies were planted. By 1694, rumors of an affair were not just circulating. They were becoming royal crisis material. Then, Count Königsmarck vanished. He was last seen entering the Linischloss Palace in Hanover. Some say he came to negotiate safe passage for himself and Sophia Dorothea to flee. Others believe he was lured there under false pretenses. Whatever the reason, he was never seen again. His disappearance was sudden, total, and, unsurprisingly, officially unexplained. Years later, rumors emerged of blood found on the palace floor, of bribes paid to guards, of a secret burial beneath the palace grounds. No body was ever found. No investigation ever reached a conclusion. But the fallout was immediate. Sophia Dorothea was placed under house arrest, first symbolically, then permanently. Her marriage to George Louis was dissolved, her title stripped. She was relocated to the castle of Ahlden, a quiet fortress in the German countryside where she would spend the next 3 decades under surveillance, forbidden from seeing her children, forbidden from traveling, forbidden from leaving. To the public, she ceased to exist. Inside the castle, she aged slowly and out of sight. Her letters, few and carefully censored, reflect a woman alternately bitter, resigned, and defiant. She maintained that she had been falsely accused, that her only crime was loving someone who loved her back. George Louis went on to become King George III of Great Britain in 1714. He ruled from afar, rarely visiting England, barely bothering to speak English, and never once acknowledging the wife he had discarded. When Sophia Dorothea died in 1726, she was buried without ceremony. George refused to allow public mourning. Even in death, she was treated as a political inconvenience. But the legend remained. In paintings, in poems, in secret histories passed between European courts, Sophia Dorothea became the cautionary tale of a royal woman who dared to love and lost everything. And if her tragedy was written in exile, the next royal, Princess Caroline Matilda, sister of George III, would inherit a similar fate, only with more fire, more foreign drama, and a love affair that ignited a revolution, literally and emotionally. Her downfall wouldn't come quietly. It would come with a king, a doctor, and a betrayal that changed the course of a nation. 28. Princess Caroline Matilda, sister of George III. There are quiet scandals, and there are roaring ones, and then there's Princess Caroline Matilda, a woman who walked into a foreign court, married a king who never loved her, fell for a man who wasn't supposed to matter, and lit the fuse on one of the most bizarre royal collapses in European history. Born in 1751, Caroline Matilda was the youngest daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Her birth came just 3 months after her father's death, which meant she arrived into a royal household already weighted by absence. Raised alongside her older brother, soon to be King George III, she grew up in a strange mixture of privilege and insulation. Well-educated, genteel, fluent in multiple languages, and equipped with the usual royal skill set: painting, letter writing, and the art of keeping one's opinions to oneself. Except that last part never really stuck. At the age of just 15, Caroline Matilda was sent to Denmark to marry her cousin, King Christian VII. The match had the usual logic of the time: cement Protestant alliances, keep the bloodlines tidy, and avoid the costly nuisance of marrying commoners with personalities. Denmark got a British princess. Britain got influence in Copenhagen. And Caroline Matilda got a deeply troubled husband. Christian VII was young, erratic, and, to put it politely, emotionally unstable. Even his own court admitted that he was unfit for domestic happiness. He drank heavily, engaged in compulsive and often public misbehavior, and surrounded himself with sycophants who enabled his worst impulses. Their marriage, unsurprisingly, was a disaster. The Queen, isolated in a foreign country, struggled to find allies. She gave birth to an heir early, Frederick VI, born in 1768, but her relationship with Christian deteriorated quickly after. He spent most of his time traveling, gambling, and cavorting with mistresses and hangers-on, leaving Caroline Matilda alone at court, with little to do but smile politely and watch her reputation erode. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor who arrived at court first as Christian's personal physician, then as his unofficial advisor, and eventually as the most powerful man in Denmark. Struensee was everything Christian wasn't: brilliant, composed, politically savvy, and fluent in Enlightenment ideals. He believed in modernizing Denmark, reforming its legal system, and sweeping away centuries of dusty absolutism. He also, as court gossip quickly noted, began spending an extraordinary amount of time with the Queen. It started innocently, discussions over policy, shared interest in literature, mutual frustration with Christian's behavior. But before long, Struensee was seen entering her private chambers late at night. Letters began to circulate. Glances were noticed. Servants whispered. The friendship blurred, then collapsed entirely into what was widely believed to be a full-blown affair. Now it's worth noting, this was no ordinary court scandal. Caroline Matilda and Struensee weren't just lovers, allegedly. They were co-conspirators in an unofficial regency. With Christian increasingly incapacitated, Struensee issued royal edicts in the king's name. Caroline Matilda supported them. For nearly 2 years, the doctor and the queen effectively ran Denmark. Reforms rolled out at an astonishing pace. Corporal punishment was reduced. Censorship was relaxed. Noble privileges were curbed. The aristocracy, predictably, was furious. And as their anger mounted, so did the danger. By 1772, a coup was underway. Orchestrated by conservative nobles and the Dowager Queen, the plan was swift and brutal. Struensee was arrested in the dead of night. Caroline Matilda was taken into custody and separated from her children. Christian VII, predictably oblivious, signed off on it all. Struensee was tried for treason and executed. Caroline Matilda was banished. The evidence of their affair? Thin, mostly circumstantial, and padded with hysteria. But it didn't matter. The court had decided, and the facts would be made to fit. She was exiled to Celle in northern Germany, a poetic echo of another royal woman, Sophia Dorothea, who had suffered a nearly identical fate half a century earlier. There, Caroline Matilda lived out her days in quiet disgrace, never allowed to return to Denmark, never again to see her children. She died of scarlet fever at just 23 years old. But her story didn't fade. In time, historians would revisit the legend. The brilliant reformer and the brave queen who tried to change a kingdom and fell victim to the machinery of royal fear. Caroline Matilda was remembered not as a sinner, but as a symbol of rebellion, of intellect, of the danger of female agency in a world that demanded silence. And if her fall was Shakespearean, the woman who comes next, Catherine Swynford, the longtime mistress turned duchess, would leave her mark not through scandal alone, but by rewriting her status so thoroughly that centuries of monarchs would descend from a woman once dismissed as a footnote. Hers is a tale of power built on persistence, and a romance that reshaped the royal bloodline from the outside in. 29. Catherine Swynford, Duchess of Lancaster. Catherine Swynford didn't enter the royal story with a bang. She arrived quietly, almost invisibly, on the edges of court life, a minor noblewoman with neither a title nor a fortune. But by the time she was finished, she had become one of the most quietly consequential women in English history. Mistress to a king's son, wife to a duke, and mother to a dynasty that would eventually birth the Tudors, her name is now laced through centuries of power like a hidden thread. Never the center, always the origin. And yes, her love life? Not exactly chaste. Catherine was born around 1350, likely in Hainaut, modern-day Belgium. Her family was respectable but not powerful. Her father, Péon de Roët, was a herald in the court of Philippa of Hainaut, queen consort to Edward III. Through this connection, Catherine was brought to England and placed as a lady-in-waiting in the household of the powerful Lancaster family. From there, she married Hugh Swynford, a knight of modest means. It was a solid, respectable match. But it wasn't the story people would remember. What they would remember began sometime in the 1370s, after Catherine had become a widow. She re-entered court life as a governess to the children of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, brother to the Black Prince, and arguably the most powerful man in England not sitting on a throne. At the time, John was married to Blanche of Lancaster, and after her death, to Infanta Constance of Castile, in a union built more on politics than anything resembling affection. But even before his second marriage, John and Catherine's relationship had shifted. What began in proximity, in the raising of children, shared grief, and long periods at court, became intimate, and then public. Their affair lasted years, decades. It produced 4 children, known as the Beauforts, named for one of John's estates, and baptized without shame, but very much outside the protective circle of legitimacy. For a time, the court tolerated the arrangement. John's status made him nearly untouchable, and Catherine, while not noble in name, was noble in conduct. She never flaunted her influence. She never sought power. She simply stayed. But politics are fickle. As John's ambitions for the Castilian throne floundered, and England's internal tensions rose, the optics of an enduring affair with a common-born governess became problematic. For a time, Catherine was dismissed from court. The affair was paused. Whether by decree or discretion, it's unclear. But it didn't end. Eventually, Constance of Castile died. And in an extraordinary twist that even chroniclers struggled to explain without a trace of judgment, John of Gaunt married Catherine Swynford. This wasn't a scandalous elopement. It was a formal, state-approved union. The king's son had married his longtime mistress. In doing so, he did something even more extraordinary. He legitimized their children. The Beauforts were brought into the royal fold, allowed to hold titles, marry well, and, most crucially, exist in the royal succession, albeit with a formal clause of disqualification from the crown. That clause would, in true Plantagenet fashion, be ignored whenever convenient. The Beaufort line gave rise to Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, which means that Catherine Swynford, the quiet governess, the whispered mistress, the woman who waited 2 decades to marry the man she loved, became the grandmother of kings. But if her lineage reshaped English history, her personal story remains even more compelling. Catherine's relationship with John of Gaunt wasn't a passing court amusement. It was deep, durable, and, if their letters and actions are any indication, genuinely affectionate. They remained close even during her exile from court, and when they married, it wasn't out of duty or ambition. It was the culmination of something already real, already lasting. That said, the court never fully forgave her origins. She was never styled as a queen, though she outranked most noble women. Her children were always seen as just a little suspect, and Catherine herself, despite her influence, never pursued more than what was already hers. No titles, no property wars, just a quiet presence at the center of a dynasty. Her burial, beside John of Gaunt in Lincoln Cathedral, was as close as she came to royal honors. And yet, her influence seeped forward through generations, not in battles fought, but in bloodlines secured. Was Catherine a seductress, a patient strategist, or simply a woman who, in a world that offered her no clear place, made one through love and longevity? Whatever the answer, she left behind a kind of legacy that outlives rumors. No palace scandal ever stuck. No chronicler ever accused her of manipulation. She simply endured, and was remembered. And from one woman who patiently rewrote the royal order, we move to another whose place in royal history was anything but patient. Empress Matilda, the daughter of a king and the mother of another, was never content to be a political pawn. Her rumored lovers, and her ferocious ambition, carved a bloody path toward a throne she claimed, held, and lost, all without ever being crowned. 30. Empress Matilda, mother of Henry II. Empress Matilda was never going to be anyone's decorative royal. She wasn't born to serve, to smile, or to curtsy. She was born to rule. And the only problem was that the world wasn't quite ready for that. Not from a woman, not from her. So instead of wearing a crown, she wore an empire's frustration. And in her wake, she left behind a country at war with itself, a son destined for kingship, and, if the gossips of the 12th century are to be believed, a handful of politically dangerous entanglements with men who may have offered her more than just loyalty. She was the only surviving legitimate child of King Henry I of England, daughter of a Norman king and a Scottish Saxon princess, and from a young age her life was managed like a chessboard. At the age of 7, she was shipped off to the Holy Roman Empire to marry the emperor, an alliance that gave her a title, a crown, and her lifelong nickname, Empress. Her marriage to Emperor Henry V was not just symbolic. She was trained in court diplomacy, treated with respect rare for women in the 12th century, and participated in imperial campaigns. She rode at the front of armies. She sat in council chambers. She was, in a very real sense, already functioning as a monarch before she ever returned to England. But then Henry V died, leaving her a widow at 23. A childless widow. The kind of political wild card no court liked to deal with. So back to England she went, summoned by her father who, facing a succession crisis after the death of his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster, needed a new heir. Henry named Matilda his successor. He made his barons swear fealty to her. He arranged a second marriage, this time to Geoffrey of Anjou, a fiery, ambitious teenager with a questionable temper and impeccable French lineage. Their marriage was, by all accounts, strategic and cold. Matilda, now in her mid-20s, found herself married to a boy 5 years younger, with whom she had little in common beyond the need to produce heirs. Which they did, most notably Henry II, future King of England. But Geoffrey was not her only close male companion during this time, nor, if you listen to the whispered rumors from European courts, the most emotionally significant. Enter Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother, who stood by her through decades of political warfare. He was her commander, her closest ally, and, in the eyes of several chroniclers, a little too close for comfort. Their bond was unshakable. Robert risked everything to back her claim to the throne, even when it cost him his own lands and nearly his life. And while there's no explicit suggestion in formal records of an affair, the gossip among rival factions told a different story, that the Empress was never far from his side and rarely needed Geoffrey's. And then there's Brian Fitz-Count, another powerful nobleman whose loyalty to Matilda verged on obsessive. Brian provided her refuge when she was on the run. He was known to speak of her with the kind of reverence that suggested more than political admiration. He commanded troops in her name, wrote impassioned letters, and was one of the few men who refused to abandon her even when her chances at power crumbled. One chronicler dryly remarked that his affections were ever with the Empress, though she wore no crown. Interpret that however you like. Whether these were true romantic entanglements or simply the product of 12th century misogyny, where any powerful woman must surely be trading favors in secret, is impossible to prove. But it's clear that Matilda inspired fierce devotion from several key men who had little to gain by backing her and much to lose. Her fight for the throne, known to history as the Anarchy, was nothing short of civil war. After her father's death in 1135, Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, seized the crown, ignoring her claim and declaring himself king. What followed was 2 decades of chaos, sieges, betrayals, famine, and some of the most stubborn warfare England had seen in centuries. Matilda launched a campaign to take back the crown. She landed in England, raised armies, and captured Stephen in battle. For a brief, flickering moment in 1141, she had the throne in her grasp. She was declared Lady of the English, the nearest a woman had come to being queen regnant. But it all unraveled. Her refusal to play the docile consort, her commanding demeanor, her failure to charm the Londoners. None of it sat well with a society that could barely stomach female authority. She was driven out of the capital, Stephen was restored, and Matilda was forced into retreat. Eventually, a truce was brokered, not for her, but for her son. Matilda agreed to step aside so long as Henry would succeed Stephen, which he did in 1154. And just like that, her legacy became one of frustrated ambition passed on by blood. Did she ever truly love Geoffrey of Anjou? Possibly. Did she find solace in the company of Robert of Gloucester or Brian Fitzcount? Maybe. But love for Matilda was never the point. Power was. And if Empress Matilda fought for influence and paid in reputation, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, the next in line, would move through the glittering halls of 20th century Britain with elegance, grace, and just enough mystery to leave behind a reputation of her own, one that whispered of actors, affairs, and a royal marriage with secrets on both sides. Understood. Beginning with the next in the list, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, followed by Queen Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and then Princess Beatrice, daughter of Queen Victoria. Each segment will meet or exceed 700 words, follow your stylistic rules, and continue in the established tone. No graphic language will be used. 31. Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark married George, Duke of Kent. In a family as theatrically dysfunctional as the British royal house, it takes a particular kind of presence to stay poised while everything around you unravels. Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark was that presence. A woman whose elegance seemed carved from marble, Marina was known for her impeccable fashion sense, her icy glamour, and, according to more than one member of high society, a private life that may have been considerably warmer than the one she projected in public. Born in 1906 into a crumbling Greek monarchy, Marina was royalty twice over, her father a prince of Greece, her mother a Russian Grand Duchess, which meant, by the time she married Prince George, Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George V, she had already lived through a collapsing empire, exile, and the slow-motion implosion of the European aristocracy. Trauma makes a person composed. And Marina? She was composed like a statue in a bomb shelter. Her marriage to George in 1934 was hailed as a fairy tale. Two beautiful royals, her with cheekbones like sculpture, him with movie star charisma, married in a lavish ceremony broadcast across the empire. But behind the flashbulbs and fascinator hats, there was turbulence. George was charming, cultured, and, if the biographies are to be believed, utterly incapable of monogamy. And what did Marina do? She smiled, wore the pearls, played the part. But she also had her own friends, her own engagements, and her own private circle that, if the rumors are to be believed, may have included a few intimate friendships of her own. One of the names that surfaces most persistently is that of a well-known actor, never publicly named in court records, but referenced in biographies as a frequent dinner guest and a private companion during the Duke's absences. These absences were frequent. George, it should be noted, traveled extensively for the Navy, and his extramarital attachments were so notorious they were joked about, quietly, in court circles. Marina's possible affairs were never discussed openly. She was far too refined for scandal, but her proximity to the stage, to creative circles, to quietly eligible European diplomats and friends of the crown, always kept palace tongues busy. Some biographers hint that her stoicism wasn't repression, it was calculation. A woman who understood the transactional nature of royal marriage, who honored its public obligations while quietly reserving pieces of her emotional life for elsewhere. A hotel in Paris, a villa visit in Capri, a month-long rest in Switzerland. These were framed as health retreats, but more than one royal insider suggested they had less to do with recuperation and more to do with privacy. She raised 3 children, including Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, and remained an active working royal for decades, even after George's untimely death in a mysterious plane crash in 1942. She never remarried. Some say it was out of grief. Others suspect it was simply because the arrangement worked. Widowhood offered independence. Her public life was flawless. But the private whispers of flirtations, of friendships that were more than cordial, of an actor who may have stayed too long at Kensington, never entirely faded. And if Marina knew how to wrap a mystery in silk and smile her way past suspicion, the next royal, Queen Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, was a different creature entirely. Pious, unshakably polite, and painted in Sunday school tones, Adelaide's rumors weren't scandalous for their brazenness. They were scandalous precisely because they didn't match her image at all. 32. Queen Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. To the average history book, Queen Adelaide is the royal equivalent of a watercolor painting, soft, delicate, respectable, and vaguely forgettable. The consort of King William IV, she's remembered mostly for her moral rectitude, her religious charity, and lending her name to the city of Adelaide in Australia. But the thing about reputations that are too perfect, they invite suspicion. Born in 1792 in the Duchy of Saxe-Meiningen, Adelaide was raised in a strict, modest Lutheran household. She was pious without ostentation, intelligent without being threatening, and married at 25 to a man she barely knew, a 52-year-old British prince with more illegitimate children than titles. William had spent his earlier years dodging responsibility and accumulating mistresses like decorative furniture. He was forced into marriage because of a dynastic crisis. Adelaide was chosen because she was available, Protestant, and, most critically, uncomplicated. But Adelaide wasn't a fool. She knew what the marriage was. She made no effort to scold or reform William's past. She simply outlived it. Her demeanor was so composed, so dutiful, that even the press found nothing to attack. But that very serenity began to attract its own questions. Specifically, was she really as chaste and detached as she seemed? Some rumors, buried in letters, preserved in marginal notes of courtiers, hinted that Adelaide's moral glow might have obscured a few well-managed attachments. One of the most repeated stories involved a foreign male companion who served at her side during her early years in England. A man described as overly familiar, who appeared in multiple palace rosters and then vanished abruptly. His removal, court insiders claimed, was quietly insisted upon by higher powers. Adelaide continued to take private retreats abroad, ostensibly for health. One, in particular to Wiesbaden, drew attention when she was noted to have spent long hours in private walks with a young physician attached to the spa. Nothing came of it. No headlines, no accusations. Just an odd number of canceled appearances and a few scratched-out diary entries. It was all speculation, and yet it lingers. Her childlessness, despite multiple pregnancies, all ending in stillbirth or infant death, was seen as a personal tragedy. But for those who believed the rumors, it was also a smokescreen. That her real grief wasn't maternal, but emotional. That while she grieved for lost babies, she also grieved for the emotional connection her arranged marriage never allowed. When William died in 1837, Adelaide retired from court life. She lived quietly, supported charities, and made herself politically invisible. But even in her retirement, there were patterns, visits from old acquaintances who never signed the guest book. Long correspondence with a European nobleman whose letters were burned upon her death, and just enough royal discomfort with her independence to suggest that her legacy was, perhaps, a little more complicated than good queen, bad luck. And if Adelaide was the mystery you almost forget to notice, Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria, was the opposite. Trapped in the Victorian machine, she made just enough trouble to get noticed, but never quite enough to be free. Her love life, her entanglements, and her thwarted romances were like faded ink on the margins of the royal family, easy to miss until you start looking. 33. Princess Beatrice, daughter of Queen Victoria. By the time Princess Beatrice was born in 1857, Queen Victoria had already buried her beloved Prince Albert and wrapped herself in mourning. Beatrice, the youngest of Victoria's 9 children, never stood a chance of being just a daughter. She was destined, assigned really, to be a companion, a caretaker, and, as the Queen once put it bluntly, mine. The arrangement was clear. Beatrice would never marry. She would remain at her mother's side, take dictation, accompany her on state occasions, and effectively serve as Victoria's personal secretary until the Queen's death. It was a royal life, yes, but also a cloistered one. No freedom, no husband, no room to fall in love, which of course meant Beatrice did fall in love, multiple times. The first hints of rebellion came in her early 20s, when she formed what Victoria called inappropriate emotional attachments to several young male courtiers and staff members, men she was not permitted to be alone with, let alone correspond with. One, in particular, was a Scottish equerry whose transfer from the royal household came with no explanation but much speculation. Beatrice reportedly refused to speak for days. Another close companion was a German composer, hired to provide music lessons but seen by some as a little too frequently present in Beatrice's sitting rooms. She defended him, pleaded for his employment to continue, and was devastated when he was dismissed on a vague charge of familiarity. In court code, that usually means someone got too close. But the most dramatic turn came in 1885 when Beatrice, against her mother's wishes, fell in love with and secretly arranged to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg, a minor German royal. When Victoria found out, she was furious. Beatrice wept, then waited, then won. Victoria relented, on one condition. Beatrice and Henry had to live with her, full time, even after the wedding. So Beatrice married and brought her husband home to live with her mother. It was, predictably, miserable. Beatrice and Henry managed a few years of happiness before he died of malaria in 1896. But even during the marriage, Beatrice's attachments didn't stop. She formed strong emotional bonds with male friends, corresponded in what biographers politely call ardent language, and remained under her mother's controlling shadow until Victoria's death in 1901. Only then, in middle age, did Beatrice begin to breathe. But by then, her romances were in the past, flashes of possibility that had never quite reached reality. And like so many royal women before her, her legacy was quietly rewritten to suit the narrative: dutiful daughter, loyal widow, royal secretary. The passionate friendships, the suppressed romances, the emotional betrayals, all carefully cropped out of the official portraits. And yet, if Beatrice lived a life of carefully managed affection, the next royal in our story, Catherine Howard, lived at the opposite extreme. Her story didn't fade quietly. It burned through the Tudor court like gunpowder wrapped in velvet, ending in accusations, downfall, and a place in history as one of Henry VIII's most tragic wives.